The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 661 Cringe. John was aiming for a long, drawn-out fight to maximize his advantages, so let alone a few weeks, even a few months was acceptable. The hard part was not waiting, it was staying hidden, as his opponent was truly, genuinely skilled. This was perhaps the most difficult fight he had ever experienced, which is why the reward would no doubt be so much sweeter. But John wasn't the only one locked in a tough battle. Down on Earth, Marlowe's domain was under attack. Although, as of yet, the attack had not reached the level that Raphael had predicted, things were moving in the direction he predicted. He suspected that the enemy wanted to exhaust all their energy and resources before they came in for the finish, to prevent the use of any unexpected, hidden trump cards. But none of that had anything to do with Lex, at least for now. He had his hands full with his own endeavors, and could not afford to be distracted. Even meeting Alexander was a luxury he would not have availed if Fenrir were not still asleep. NOV/LU/SB, C0, So how come you suddenly thought of sparring? Lex asked. From what I recall, you were extremely busy with your mission. Taking time off to fight a few rounds does not exactly sound like the best course of action when chasing terrorists. Not to mention, you don't look too great either. Alexander gave Lex an exhausted look, before letting out a long sigh. Things are not going well, Alexander confided. There are too many unusual aspects about my current mission. You know, I used to think that I was thoroughly disadvantaged as someone who was raised on Earth. If I had received the nurturing of the Empire from birth, I would have been much stronger. The teenager paused for a moment, as a waiter arrived and began laying food at the table, but then figured he wasn't saying anything confidential, so he just continued. But, lately, I've finally come to realize a significant advantage I have based on my upbringing. Oh, what is that? Lex asked as he began having fries. I've avoided the lifelong conditioning and propaganda that comes with living in such an environment. When I see things, I can retain an objective view, which allows me to see patterns and trends others are blind to. The Empire is supposed to be this unstoppable behemoth, which has managed to gain control of over 20 galaxies and retained full control of each one. Can you even imagine 20 galaxies? Each one filled with vast, endless space. Each one populated with hundreds of trillions of different races. Each and every one of them harboring their own intricate and delicate internal systems of trade, competition, enmities, intrigue, politics, wars, and more. Yet despite all of that, in its history, the control of the Empire has never supposedly wavered. That's the history that I was taught, or an overview of it. This control has been maintained through the use of excellent and ingenious administration, but moreover, a very advanced and powerful military, which is divided into various categories. One of the more important branches is the cross-regional interstellar neutralizing godfiend experts, cringe. They are one of the most elite units, who scout talented recruits from each and every galaxy and train them to be loyal only to the Empire, as they can be deployed absolutely anywhere to ensure safety and stability of the Empire. The entire specific purpose of cringe is to ensure that no major force within the Empire ever harbors rebellious thoughts. After all, there are quite a few forces in the galaxies who could make life incredibly difficult for the Empire. Lex was listening very seriously to Alexander, doing his best to not distract the kid as he continued to eat during his speech. But after the pause he took extended a little too long, Lex had to quickly swallow to ask a question. I take it that something happened to them? As if woken from a reverie, Alexander was momentarily startled, before he refocused again. No, nothing happened to them. It's just that such a force already exists. Yet more and more often, across the Empire, there are reports of small forces trying to gain independence from the Empire. Such a trend is not limited to just one galaxy, but is occurring in many of them. Even the large forces don't dare to cross the Empire, so why are so many of the small ones taking that step? But, for now, the trend is completely insignificant. Based on the size and strength of the Empire, such a thing will never destabilize it. Yet the fact that the trend even exists is concerning me. Moreover, instead of reducing, the terrorist attacks across the empire are increasing. As if that's not enough, I've heard rumors that the fiery mammoths are showing signs of aggression. That is not an adversary the empire can just shrug off. The timing of it all, it just doesn't seem right. I don't know if I'm imagining things, but I keep seeing all these signs as precursors to something absolutely devastating. And if something happens, which can be described as devastating to the empire, I don't even know what we can do to survive. Looking at the teenager, Lex could not help but pause. It was easy to always see him as Alexander, the incredibly talented and driven young man who had taken it upon himself to venture out into space alone, to build a place for himself in the vast universe. Yet as a result of that, it was also easy to forget that, at the end of the day, he was a teenager. To be clear, he did not look depressed, or even demotivated. If anything, he actually felt stronger than when Lex saw him last. It was highly likely that Alexander would be able to regulate his own mood himself soon enough. In fact, if Lex hadn't made him sit to chat, and instead directly consented to the spar, it was unlikely he would have mentioned anything at all. Still, Lex felt like giving him a little motivation couldn't hurt. "Do you know about the Henali?" Lex asked, taking a bite from his burrito between words. "I've heard about and studied the Henali convention, if that's what you're talking about." "No, not that." "Well, it doesn't really matter. All you need to know is that, even the almighty empire has to abide by the rules set forth by the Henali, or the Henali Convention. So, atop the seemingly insurmountable force of the empire, there is a bigger force. Yet even they, the Henali, cannot blatantly do as they please, and have to show due respect to a small, certain group of people. So that means that there are bigger fish than even them out there. Who knows how far along that chain goes? The point is, the universe is a big place, and as hard as it is, you have to accept that you're only a small part of it. Instead of focusing on far-off and distant things, it's a lot more useful to focus on growing your own strength. That way, when you face any problems, you can do your best to resolve them. And if you can't, you can always run back to the inn. Although his last words were not the most pleasant to hear, Alexander seemed somewhat relieved to hear them. But the effect was only limited, as Alexander was only somewhat exhausted, he had not succumbed to the pressures he faced. The two continued to chat for a while longer as Lex ate. As absurd as it seemed, he really did need to consume such large amounts of food to keep his body running effectively. Although his dependence on food had dropped drastically, it was not eliminated. Besides, he liked it. But once the meal was coming close to ending, Lex could not help but bring the topic to their upcoming spar. "You never really answered my question about why you wanted to spar," he said, before grabbing some sushi with his spirit sense. "Like I said, the situation is bad. I need to improve my strength. Raising my cultivation realm would be the best solution, but it will take a considerable amount of time, especially since I have no time to cultivate at all these days. The next best thing is increasing my repertoire and getting my hands on new techniques. But while I have learnt the techniques, I'm not sure how effectively I can deploy them amidst battle yet. That's where you come in. If we spar, I don't really need to worry about hurting you, so I can go all out without any reservation. It's the closest thing to a live combat test I can get." "What, the Empire doesn't have sparring bots?" Alexander winced as he heard that. "They do, and I can't afford to keep breaking those." Chapter 662 Spar. "Oh?" Lex asked, intrigued. "Seems like you've been putting in a lot of practice." "I had to practice the technique somewhere. How was I supposed to know that if I break a training bot, I have to pay for it?" Alexander said bitterly. For the first time, he felt the bitter pinch of poverty, as he didn't want to use his family's resources during this time where they were preparing to shift from Mars to Vegas Minima. "Now you're making me curious. Let's head to a training hall. But, just a heads up, I don't have a lot of time, so this can only be a short sparring session." Alexander accepted, and the two made their way to the nearest training hall. Although Lex was looking forward to having a proper spar with Alexander, he knew that his current purpose was to allow the latter to become more accustomed to his latest techniques. "We can get right into it and start the fight," Lex offered, "or you can first test out your techniques on me to practice. You don't need to be worried about holding back, I've improved considerably since we've last met. In fact, if you manage to actually hurt me, I'd be extremely impressed. No, treat this as a normal fight. The whole point is to see if I can deploy the techniques under the pressure of combat. Moreover, some of the techniques rely on the element of surprise. Knowing about them beforehand can severely reduce the impact." With the decision made, Lex no longer hesitated. Without forewarning, Lex launched himself at Alexander. Due to Lex's current abnormal strength, his speed was devastating and not easy to cope with, especially in the range that they were in. Holding nothing back, Lex threw a punch towards Alexander's face, completely expecting to make contact. But, surprisingly, Alexander had already started to evade even before Lex began to throw the punch. Instantly a couple of thoughts ran through Lex's mind. First, he was fighting against someone who had some semblance of instincts similar to his own. Second, since attacks with a limited area of impact, such as punches, could be easily avoided by making small movements under the guidance of instincts, he should aim for harder to dodge attacks. Instead of punching, Lex decided to tackle Alexander with his body instead. Surely Alexander would have tried to dodge this as well, but Lex was moving too fast and they were too close. Lex came in like a wrecking ball and smashed the teenager across the room, leaving destruction in his wake. The training room they were in was supposed to be able to accommodate golden core experts, but Alexander's body broke several of the floor tiles and cracked several of the pillars in the room as he hit them. To be honest, Lex suddenly felt a little guilty about hitting him so hard. In fact, his guilt slowly started to eat at him, and Lex began to wonder if his own sheer awesomeness had left behind a permanent scar in Alexander's psyche. Lex fell to his knees, on the verge of wailing about the absolute tragedy that was destroying the future of such a promising young lad, when he realized that his emotions were abnormal. It was when he had that realization that he also realized that his instincts were warning him of something, but he had been too focused on his guilt to focus on it. A golden laser as thin as about a golf ball suddenly hit Lex on the forehead. Lex had been too slow to dodge, as even he could not keep up with the speed of light, but the laser barely harmed him. Besides making him feel slightly warm, it brought a slight red color to his skin where he was hit, and a single tendril of smoke escaped. Lex suddenly woke up from his abnormal state and realized that at some point, Alexander must have attacked his spirit. The fact that it had worked, however briefly, was absolutely startling. For a moment, both Lex and Alexander looked at each other as if they were looking at monsters. Lex could not believe his mind was affected, for that would require influencing his spirit. But since his spirit was fused with his body and soul, they had the same level of defense. Theoretically speaking, since Lex had survived a physical attack from an immortal, then his spirit should also be able to do the same, albeit he had only survived that attack, and came out of it heavily injured. Still, the comparison was enough to explain how difficult it was to sway Lex's mind. Alexander, on the other hand, looked at Lex like some kind of freak out of a fiction novel, for being able to survive such an attack completely unharmed had to be fictional. The spirit attack Alexander had launched on Lex was an incredibly powerful one which required him to make many preparations before battle ever even began. That meant if he used the attack once, he could not use it again unless he went back and prepared again. But it was worth it, for against a single powerful opponent, let alone freeze them, it could even completely destroy their psyche. Yet Lex had only suffered some mild guilt. Moreover, he recovered in less than a second. Then there was the laser. He had actually killed many golden core cultivators using that technique with a single hit, yet it could not even singe Lex's hair. For a moment, both of them admired each other's skills, labeling the other as a freak. Then combat continued. Lex popped in his fancy lenses and, supported by his instincts, became impossible to hit. Moreover, since this was a spar, began testing out some theories that he always had. His favorite technique these days, impervious hands, had a lot more potential than he initially assumed. Not only did it have a monumentally stronger defense, he could fuse his soul and spirit sense into it to be able to interact with souls and energy respectively. Moreover, once the technique was active, if he augmented it with more spirit energy, he could directly touch whatever affinity Lex had. While previously his affinity was a vague and abstract concept, he had since developed an affinity to space. He wanted to see how his technique would be affected by that. Moreover, he wanted to see how well he could consciously control the energy in his opponent's attacks. The triad that followed wrought untold destruction across the training room. It looked like a tornado had been trapped in the room rather than two people sparring. Lex's absurd physical strength was alone in taking credit for the damage. Alexander had learned a number of new techniques that relied on the golden-colored laser he shot Lex with earlier. Lex's strength and Alexander's lasers jointly became so destructive, they actually had to pause the sparring because it compromised the integrity of the training room. But since Lex still had more time, they just shifted to a new room and continued to fight. Lex had to give Alexander genuine recognition. Although it could not be said that Lex was going all out, he had not held his physical strength back at all. Despite taking a few hits head-on, Alexander seemed to be doing fine. In fact, Lex could subtly detect the means Alexander was using to negate the strength of his attacks, but that did not reduce how impressive the task was. After all, who said one needed to take on all attacks? Not everyone was built as tough as Lex, so it was completely unfair to expect them to do so. No V1 USB, COM. In the end, after a few hours of fighting, Mary finally informed Lex that Fenrir had woken up. As much as he enjoyed the fight, that was his cue to depart, so he informed Alexander. But, instead of ending it, Alexander asked Lex to withstand one last attack from him. Unlike his previous techniques, which he was proficient enough in to use in battle, this one would take some time to prepare, so he needed to ask Lex to stand still. Once Lex agreed, Alexander quickly sat on the floor, cross-legged, as if he was meditating. But he was clearly not. The 6 blades that were by now Alexander's signature weapons were summoned and arranged themselves in a circle, pointing towards his palms. Beads of golden light began dripping across the lengths of the blades, falling from the tip into his hands as if they were liquid light. At first, Lex only watched silently and observed, but as time went on, the energy accumulating in Alexander's hands began pressuring him. Although Lex was far from threatened, his eyes widened as he realized just how incredible Alexander was progressing. In fact, considering that the other was doing so well without a system made Lex feel a little ashamed. He decided to lend Alexander some help. Chapter 663 Battlefields. It took Alexander quite a few minutes to completely gather enough liquid light in his hands to complete his attack. Once he opened his eyes and looked at Lex, the light in his hands began to effervesce and began to toss about as if bubbling with untamable energy. Time seemed to slow down as Lex focused on the seated teenager. Maintaining eye contact, Alexander opened his mouth and ushered a single word, but Lex never heard it. There was an explosion of bright light, completely blinding not only him but the contact lenses as well. Moreover, a prickling sensation covered Lex's entire body, as if an army of ants was walking all over his skin. He tried opening his eyes to determine what had happened, but discovered that his movements were extremely slow and disoriented. When he finally managed to open his eyes, Lex discovered, to his astonishment, that he felt dizzy. Moreover, he seemed to be looking at the ceiling. An involuntary grunt escaped his mouth as he eventually tried to move. As incredible as it may sound, Lex's body was incredibly sore and stiff, which made it uncomfortable for him to move. When he finally recovered from whatever attack he had just suffered, Lex discovered that he was, once again, completely naked. Although his body was not too hurt, the fact that his body had turned completely red, as if sunburned, was already a testament to the strength of Alexander's attack. Whatever this attack was, it had still not managed to break his skin, but internally, he felt like his bones had been thoroughly rattled. "That was a good one," Lex said out loud as he picked himself up. The pale-looking Alexander, who had overexerted himself for that attack, had his mouth hung open as he tried to imagine what exactly it would take to hurt Lex. "Thanks," he managed to mumble as Lex helped him stand. "I have something for you," Lex said, as he summoned the crystal crown he got so long ago from the crystal realm. This was an extremely useful tool that Lex had once termed as his thinking cap. It allowed Lex to artificially enter a flow-like state, and it was much stronger than Lex's own ability, or at least it was back then. Now, after multiple breakthroughs, Lex no longer needed it. "This thing is called Isilgarb, although I just usually refer to it as my thinking cap. It can only be used by people who follow the true path. Try it out." Lex tossed the crown to Alexander as if it was a toy instead of a precious tool, which greatly startled Alexander, especially since he was still disoriented. But then he remembered he had spirit sense, so he directly grabbed the crown out of the air and put it on his head. After channeling his spirit energy through the crown, Alexander experienced the wonderful feeling of the heightened flow state, and immediately understood its value. "Are you sure you don't need this?" he asked, taking the crown off. Currently, he did not have the energy to spare to continue using it. "Yes, it's not that useful for me anymore, so you might as well get some use out of it. The next few months I'll be slightly busy, so if you need me, try to leave a message in advance." Then, without waiting for Alexander to reply, Lex teleported away. It was a bad habit he developed while acting as the innkeeper. Even though Lex had left, Alexander still had some more free time, so he decided to stay at the inn and recover from his exhaustion for a bit. He exited the training room and was heading towards the lazy river when he saw a familiar face, one he hadn't seen in a while. Russian Princess 77 was standing there, seemingly waiting for him. Why was she always so creepy like that? But then again, she was always extremely helpful. Back when he was still on Earth, she seemed to maintain some sort of advantage over him in cultivation. He thought that after everything he went through, he would finally overtake her, but no. His instincts were clearly warning him that she still had formidable strength. "Long time no see," he said, as he walked to her. "Yeah, it has been a while. I wish we could catch up, but you have no time. You really need to return to work." "Huh?" Alexander didn't immediately understand what she was saying, so she clarified. "Trust me, you want to go back to work as quickly as possible. When you get free again next time, look for me. I have a favor to ask of you." Alexander was supposed to have a lot of free time, otherwise he would not have come to the inn. But he already had some experience with Russian Princess 77's prophetic advice, so he decided to listen to her, and returned. The moment he reappeared in his room back on Polbitby, the sound of someone banging on his door welcomed him. Alarmed, he quickly opened the door to find his immediate superior, immortal Valkyrie, standing there. For some reason, probably due to his exhaustion from overexerting his energy, he had the deranged thought that Valkyrie looked somewhat similar to Lex. He immediately erased that thought, as he didn't want to curse his friend out like that. "What's wrong with you?" she asked bluntly, clearly staring at his disheveled state. "I was training. I had some free time while my latest report was being processed." "Well, free time is over. I have no proof, but I feel like I know what Jeffrey and his organization are after on this planet. In a few months, an incredibly important VIP will pass through here. I believe he is their target. Your new task is to find proof of that." While Lex returned to the Crystal Realm, to once again journey through the bog, and Alexander was being ordered around by immortal Valkyrie, things on Earth were extremely chaotic. The invasion of New York had been going on for many days, but it suddenly took a turn for the worse. It was as if the AI had stopped focusing everywhere on Earth, and instead were only attacking there. Raphael was in the command center, organizing 4 different battles being held in different parts of the state, and yet it seemed like more invaders were coming from everywhere. Even if he wanted to defend, there were no more soldiers for him to muster. "Anakin, what's the status on your side? You think you'll be done soon?" "Nearly there," was the only response he got. On Anakin's side, he was standing over the defeated body of one of the AI. While many of them had organic bodies, he finally encountered one which had a body made from machines, or at least machines as identified on Earth. When the war started, young Anakin Indiana McLean was actually slightly scared. But once he got over that initial bout of fear, he discovered how liberating war really was. He had strength, and he had Raphael's guidance, keeping him from messing up. All that was left was to have lots of fun. You know, Anakin said, as he brought his face near the robotic body lying on the ground, I've heard the world's first computer virus was in Lahore, Pakistan. I know a Pakistani guy who lives in Queens. I wonder if I can get him to make a virus for you. The AI did not respond, but only kept looking up at Anakin. In truth, the battle was already over, but Anakin had been looking for prisoners he could take. He finally found one that would fill his needs. I also have a Russian friend who is holed up near Brooklyn. I wonder if 30 terabytes of kinky grandma videos will slow down your processing or not. The robot had no idea what Anakin was saying, but it got the feeling that it should be afraid. But Anakin was not paying attention to the robot's reaction, anyway. He had thrown his head back and was laughing maniacally, and the shadows in the surrounding area were trembling, as if laughing along with him. Inside Anakin's soul, an old evil grandpa was watching everything, feeling the satisfaction of watching the younger generation grow up. On another battlefield Raphael was controlling, Larry was fighting like a madman. Influenced heavily by Marlowe, Larry had a deceivingly sly battle style, relying on his inescapable control over metal. Unlike Anakin's battles, where he occasionally took prisoners to study more about their enemies, Larry left no survivors. Most of the time, he left no corpses either. The third battlefield was the most unusual. All the soldiers did not rush forward, and only held defensive positions, while Suda alone fought all the enemies. After the death of his previous master, Suda had received a number of quests which involved gathering special materials which could be found in the invading aliens' bodies. Once he completed the quests, and gathered the supplies, his system absorbed them and underwent an evolution, turning from a samurai system to a Ronin system. The system had become much stronger, and thus, so had Suda. The final battlefield was Marlowe's. Unlike the others, he had no soldiers backing him up. He was a lone soldier, facing the bulk of the invasion on his own. Chapter 664, Traveling. Once again, Lex was riding Fenrir to pass through the bog. The area he was passing through right now was extremely dangerous, not because of the darkness or the monsters, but some unknown danger. Both Fenrir and Lex felt an extreme threat as soon as they neared, which was unusual for no such danger was mentioned on the map they were following. As such, Lex was at least reassured in knowing that he had managed to get his suit's Jeeves. He was not wearing his first suit, which Jeeves had designed for frustratingly sturdy defense, but the second one, made from Orion scales. The second suit was designed for stealth, and went even beyond the features the scales provided. The scales could perfectly hide energy signatures, making it easy for one to hide from spirit sense and scanners, yet did nothing for visibility. That issue was handled by other features of the attire. The suit Lex was wearing was styled differently from contemporary suits, and was more in line with the fashion trends of Earth during the 19th century. The color was an unusual blend, which would more easily allow Lex to completely disappear in even the mildest shadows, yet at the same time allow him to fall perfectly into the background even in completely illuminated environments. The pants were straight but smart, the waistcoat quite fitted to his body, and a small bow tie. It was the coat that was most distinct as it required only the top button to be closed, for underneath it the coat slanted sideways, no longer covering Lex's chest, and transitioned into a kind of cape. Apparently the style was called a frock coat. Although it sacrificed a lot in terms of defensive capabilities, that was never really a requirement at all. Allowed to focus completely on stealth, Jeeves was able to provide Lex with a suit that would allow him to disappear without the need for any spiritual techniques at all. Now that, on top of Fenrir's already impressive abilities, made it so that Lex did not need to be worried about being detected. Yet still the feeling of danger persisted. During this period the duo was extremely careful, and Lex was ready to enter his flow state at any moment. For once, his trusty and handy lenses failed him, in the regard that they were not able to detect the source of any danger. But fortunately, 8 hours later, they left the area unharmed and uninterrupted. The days later, they finally left the bog and entered the Sentinel territory. Here, Fenrir's stealth would play an important role once again. Novelu, SB, C.0, M. The Sentinel race could not exactly be called xenophobic, as they had good relations with many races. Unfortunately, humans were not included among those races. The Sentinels were a humanoid race with extremely strong spirits but weak physical bodies. As it turns out, the resources they needed to then cultivate their bodies were often the same as those required by humans. In this matter, they were even more sensitive than humans, for they absolutely needed those resources. If they did not continuously strengthen their bodies, they would not be able to support their growing spirit. In the end, they would be bottlenecked and unable to grow. The lack of resources and the competitive nature of cultivation ensured that the two races were never able to become allies. Even at their best, the two races were able to maintain a hostile neutrality, with countless small skirmishes. There was a small note in the map stating that if Lex had a good relationship with the Sentinels, he could take a teleportation formation from one of their cities and skip a lot of the traveling he was about to face. Unfortunately, Lex had never developed a relationship with them, and thus would not be able to do that. Taking the longer route was his only option. He would have to traverse the Sentinel territory into the unclaimed lands, which would be a stretch of territory where no sentient race had laid claim. Such lands were common, and could be either completely safe, or home to exceptionally strong or dangerous beasts. There was no real way of knowing. The duo continued their journey, managing to avoid detection throughout. Weeks later, once they crossed the unclaimed lands, they faced a lake. Although it was called a lake, the body of water was larger even than the oceans on Earth. Crossing the lake was not hard as Fenrir was easily capable of running on water, or at least it was not supposed to be. 2 days into their journey, a flock of Frio birds appeared in the sky and clashed with a nearby flock of soul birds. At first, Lex thought that they were fighting, but it quickly became obvious that they were involved in some kind of mating ritual. As happy as Lex felt for the local population of these massive divine birds, the results of their ritual were absolutely devastating. A storm covered the lake unlike one Lex had ever seen. Boiling water rained from the sky, beginning to evaporate even as it fell. At the same time, snow and hail battered the lake as if they had a personal vendetta. The rapidly changing temperatures, from warm to cold, from cold to freezing to instantly boiling, and then back again completely confused even nature itself. Massive tidal waves rose, but evaporated before they fell. The lake froze over, trapping even Fenrir where he ran, then erupted due to pressure accumulated due to the boiling water trapped beneath the frozen surface. It was too much, and even Lex's powerful defenses were nothing in the face of nature's fury. Eventually, they had to retreat to the inn until the natural disaster that was that mating ritual ended. But even 10 days later, nothing seemed to change. At this point, Lex was beginning to feel desperate. His destination was too far, and time was running short. Moreover, every minute his workers were out on the battlefield, risking their lives for a fight that Lex thought was completely pointless. In the end, unable to contain himself, Lex ended up back at the Infinity Emporium in an attempt to purchase a vehicle small enough to fit inside his spatial bangle, while also fast enough to make up for time that he had lost, and at the same time sturdy enough to withstand the accursed never-ending mating ritual. As it turned out, there were a few options he could take, but they all left him unsatisfied. It was then that he discovered something. Possibly due to being spoiled by his own system, he realized that as incredible as the Emporium was, it had a severe lack of rare or extremely impressive goods. That was not to say their catalog was bad. Clearly it was great, for they had helped Lex numerous times already. But even their rarest items were never of the quality or type he came to expect from systems. For example, he still had not been able to find a cloning technique that satisfied him, but he was somehow sure that if he received a cloning technique as a reward for some SSS Plus rank quest, he would be extremely pleased with it. He was too used to one-of-a-kind, overwhelmingly incredible items from his system in comparison. Normal rare items which could theoretically be found in the vaults of any large organization could no longer impress him. After all, that rarity was a result of limited market availability, and not because the item itself was actually incredibly rare and impressive. Feeling spoiled in such a manner, in the end Lex bought a small jet in the shape of a canoe. It had no thrusters or rockets or guns or anything of the sort, but came with an impressive shield that could block out even serious meteor impacts, and traveled really fast. It was not stealthy at all, and would cause multiple sonic booms on launch, but for now it fulfilled Lex's needs. He did not have the time to be picky. In the end, Lex and Fenrir returned in their new canoe, only to discover that the storm ended literally minutes after their arrival. Suppressing his agitation, Lex started the canoe and shot through the air. Fenrir tried to stick its head out of the shield to feel the wind but was nearly launched out of the canoe, and was only saved due to Lex. Moreover, the fur on its face had been pulled off as if waxed. The traumatized pup immediately squealed and threw itself in Lex's lap and began sobbing. Lex tried to keep himself from laughing, for the sight was too hilarious. Also, he had to focus on navigating, so he could not afford such a distraction. 3 days later, they arrived in the territory of a Trilop, where he could take his next teleportation formation. Meanwhile, back in the Origin realm, almost a month had passed since the Midnight Battalion had been sent on their first mission. Chapter 665 Warriors. On a continent covered in perpetual darkness by a thick curtain of clouds, the orange glow of molten lava illuminated an area clear of any and all vegetation. Only dirt, broken rocks and massive, pointed boulders protruding from the ground itself could be seen. To call the region barren would be to praise it too highly, for this was a place abandoned even by death for countless years. Only recently, due to the intense conflict, had living creatures once again crossed this plane of desolation, and the reward for their transgression was to be hunted down mercilessly. What followed then was a war that gave even the most experienced soldiers nightmares. Whether it was the elves, the treants, the werewolves, or the vampires, they all looked towards a particular battalion from only the corners of their eyes, almost flinching at the sight of them. They dared not look at them directly. They did not want to offend them. They also did not feel worthy. There, on the precipice of an ocean of magma, stood 999 soldiers radiating an aura of pure and utter annihilation, purely honed and kept in perfect control. As ash and soot rained from the sky, they stood perfectly straight, their attire lacking even a single wrinkle or speck of dirt. Whether it was when they laid siege to armies much bigger than their own, or as they ended a drought that had lasted many millennia by watering the ground in rivers of their enemies' blood, or when they walked through flames or brought down behemoths that shook the ground with every step, their appearance remained pristine, as if to say that they were not putting in any real effort. On this planet where everyone should have had similar power levels, so as to not destabilize the planet itself through too much destruction, they were an exception that totally destroyed the concept of power levels to begin with. As if rising to the challenge that this battalion of impossibly strong soldiers presented, the Fuegan revealed a plot both sinister and malefic. Having prior knowledge of the valuable resources on this planet, and anticipating that the fighting parties would not want to sacrifice the planet, they populated the planet with deadly, artificially created aliens. But the threat of those aliens, who were devouring and destroying the planet itself, was merely a curtain of deception to hide their true intentions. Due to the Midnight Battalion's relentless assault, they chased the parasites of this planet even into these lands that should have been out of their way, followed closely by the Allied forces. Here, they discovered a solitary temple, seemingly built out dirt and dead wood. Within the temple, they discovered a larva in the form of some kind of a vile deformity, still being nurtured in an amniotic sac made from the skin of beasts. Surrounding it were numerous formations, feeding it with the aura of death, of pain, of agony, of catastrophe, all accumulated during this genuine world war. But it was already too late. Although still not completely mature, upon being discovered the sac burst and the deformity was released into the world. With a wail that sounded like the misery-filled screams on a trillion souls, the thing announced its arrival. The planet itself seemed to almost fracture under that terrible cry, and suddenly every living being on that planet somehow knew that the planet was heading towards destruction. Panic, fear, confusion spread not only on the surface of the planet, but also through the many ships surrounding the planet. Immediately, the superiors decided to give up on the planet and extract all their soldiers. They could not afford to lose all their elite. Once the soldiers were evacuated, they would kill the creature by destroying the planet by using weapons of mass destruction. But, as if the creature's cry had opened Pandora's box, a meteor shower suddenly appeared out of nowhere, crashing into countless ships. After the initial strike, alien forces appeared in space, resulting in an impromptu space battle, leaving no ships free for evacuation. Hopelessness and desperation spread through the surface of the planet. All the soldiers deployed on the planet were Foundation realm, but the newly born creature was already in the Golden Core realm. Moreover, as it quickly burrowed down into the ground, eating everything in its path, its aura was rapidly growing. The creature's destination was the core of the planet, its intentions clear. Perhaps this was only the first step in an elaborate plan the Fugan had long prepared. The aliens, which had so far shown a distinct lack of unified intelligence, began coordinating impeccably to slaughter all the so-called elites. Although it was unlikely, since the creature had been born prematurely and wasn't at full strength, clearly the mastermind behind the scenes didn't want to take a chance and so wanted to occupy all the forces on ground in a fight for survival. This way, none could target the newborn. Novlusb, c. O.M. It was then, during that most hopeless hour, when death was near certainty and all their efforts seemed for naught, that some noticed this single testament of indomitability. It was like a sword that would cut through the world itself if it came in its way. It was like the first ray of sunshine, pushing back the darkness even of the abyss. It was an unstoppable force that would tear apart any immovable object that came in its way. It was the Midnight Battalion, and their increasingly fast march was their response to the wail of 1,000,000,000,000 souls. They were making their way to the tunnel that creature had dug towards the core with the spirit of warriors that could not be defeated, could not be deterred, could not be swayed. Just as some thought that perhaps there was hope, a tremor shook the planet, and molten lava erupted from the tunnel, like a volcano long stewing. The ripple of that explosion could be seen by the naked eye, and the shockwave killed thousands. But the battalion was not stopped for even a second, as they changed from 1,000 soldiers into a single undefeatable mech. With noble purpose, the mech dove into the lava itself, disappearing from view. Across the planet Armageddon seemed to have arrived. Tremors, storms, tidal waves, volcanoes, and every other kind of disaster seemed to strike all at once. Scans from orbit seemed to show that the planet was on the path to exploding. All hope was lost. This would be a grievous defeat for the Allied forces. But then, the tremors seemed to slow down, their might waning. Then, shocking every living creature that saw the scene, the ground erupted once again. Yet instead of lava, a mech and a massive insect-like creature emerged from the ground. With tens of thousands of small limbs the creature smashed the mech, and with a maw that could eat through planets the creature bit at it. Yet the mech was not only strong, but had deftness one could not expect from its massive frame. Dodging each and every attack, the mech fought back, in plain view for all to see. Very literally, this was a fight to determine the fate of a planet. The fight was devastating, to say the least. Even without the creature purposefully trying to destroy the planet, their fight seemed to put the planet in that direction. More and more lava erupted as the shockwaves from their fight seemed to break the tectonic plates, ultimately forming an ocean of lava. Yet there was no reprieve or respite. There would only be victory or death, and clearly the result had been a resounding victory. Once the creature was finally slain, the mech vanished in a cloud of smoke and the battalion was once again revealed. But, instead of the 1,000 soldiers that had formed the mech, only 999 emerged. With such a result, who would have cared? The price of a single life for such a victory was one any commander would be willing to pay. Yet it seemed everyone had misunderstood the situation. The one that was missing had not died, but had dug back into the lava as soon as the mech was dismissed. No one knew his purpose, and when anyone asked, the battalion did not respond. Long gone were the amicable and friendly workers of the inn. These were now the battle-hardened soldiers who dared to steal life back out from the jaws of death itself, and they would not reveal the purpose behind one of their soldiers' actions. Eventually, even as the planet was cleared and evacuations once again began, they chose not to move, and not to retreat. Even the Allied command, who had sent them onto this planet, ordered them to reveal what they were doing, but one of the soldiers, Gerard, simply told them to mind their own business. It was only an entire day later that a single, still-suited figure emerged from the lava ocean. The outsiders could not tell who it was, for all the members of the battalion had their faces covered, but they themselves knew who it was. It was Luther, and when he emerged from the lava, he was radiating a much more powerful aura. Clearly he had restrained himself and kept himself from entering a higher cultivation level, but even still stuck at the foundation realm, he felt much stronger than before. Let's go. The next battlefield awaits. Chapter 666, Little Devil. The 1,000 soldiers seemed to be walking casually, but they smoothly shuffled amongst one another and came into their designated spots. While their gait remained nonchalant, they would be ready to react at the first sign of trouble. From the moment of their birth, they had remained under the nurturing care of the Innkeeper, in the paradise that was the midnight inn compared to the battlefield that they had recently endured. The battle prowess be what it may be, that did not change the fact that they were now living a completely different life and were exposed to horrors and difficulties they never could have imagined. Undoubtedly, that put immense mental pressure on them. Who wanted to be on a dying, crumbling planet when they would be at the inn instead? Yet while they endured that pressure, their hearts never wavered. In fact, their determination to overcome these trials grew stronger. After all, they finally got a glimpse of the pressure the Innkeeper was keeping at bay for them. They finally saw firsthand the trials the Innkeeper was facing alone, so that they would not have to. All they had to face were enemies near the Foundation realm, while the Innkeeper had to face the entire universe himself. Through fire and fury and blood, they renewed their resolution to grow stronger, and they did. Fighting side by side, ensuring that none of their brothers or sisters was harmed, they used this war as an anvil, and their enemies as the hammer which would shape them into the fiercest warriors. Of course, it helped that their suits made them immune to any damage from a foe at their level. But that defense allowed them to survive their mistakes when they made it, and fix them so that they wouldn't make them again. Everything all right? Gerard asked Luther as he walked up beside him. Although they had supported his actions without question, no one actually knew why he had dived back into the lava. Instead of answering directly, Luther held up his right arm and conjured up a purple flame that seemed to come out of his arm itself, instead of just being summoned atop it. Near the core, I sensed something calling me, so when I had the opportunity, I returned for it. I found a feather made of purple flames that merged into my body, and strengthened me. Apparently, I was extremely compatible. Information about my change appeared in my mind. This is the purple phoenix flame, a kind of special flame that is extremely destructive, and is born under extremely special circumstances. Of course, these are not real phoenix flames, but that is just how it is named. By absorbing the flames, I have apparently activated my dormant physique, which is the 9 nether fire body. I can continuously absorb special fires into my body, and once I've collected 9 of them, they will merge and give birth to a new kind of flame. Gerard was not surprised to hear this. Over the past month, many of them had not only awakened their bloodlines, but also other special powers. There were a few of them who had unlocked strange abilities that conformed neither to any cultivation method they were aware of. Once they were evacuated, they could request their commanding officer to give them special guidance from the Allied forces training officers. Since that would only raise their battle prowess, they would not be denied. Before they were sent to this planet, they had been briefed not only on what was expected of them, but the kind of support that they could get from the Allied forces. Soon, someone with much more knowledge than them would come and teach them about the new abilities they unlocked, and how to use them. What's a special physique? Any idea? He asked, only mildly curious. He wondered if he had one. None whatsoever. but what I have figured out is the hidden reason the innkeeper sent us all here. It may look like he was just agreeing to the demands of our hosts, who own this realm, but in fact, he just wanted us to use this opportunity to experience the universe for ourselves, and discover the direction we want to go in. In the safe and secure grounds of the inn, we would never face the pressure that is required for us to grow. What do you think, Z? The teenager was walking behind them, seemingly distracted. His focus was on a floating ball above his index finger. The ball did not exist, and seemed only visible due to the fact that light passing through it was bending across its surface. The ball was also contracting and relaxing, like a beating heart. Yet the beat did not produce a sound. Instead, it seemed to spread a ripple through space itself, one which could be felt not only through one's body, but in their soul as well. It was not really a sound as it was experienced and not heard, but at the same time it reminded one of the steady beat on drums. A second such ball appeared above his middle finger, beating at a slightly faster pace. Together, the beating of the two balls produced a steady rhythm which tickled the memory of many of those around him. The rhythm was familiar, as if it was the beginning of a song they had heard, but could not exactly recall. "Sure, whatever you say," Z replied, not really paying too much attention to Luther. His focus was completely on the balls of distorted space he was playing with. Unfortunately, all of his prepared speakers broke within the last month. So now, he had to think of some alternative way of producing music. Apparently, bending space itself, before allowing it to partially return to its natural state, produced a beat like drums. Now he had to figure out how to recreate the sound of a guitar through space itself. Although this was hard, once he was finished, he would be able to play his music inside a vacuum as well. That would surely help in space fights. He was looking forward to it. Everyone around him chuckled, but said nothing. Over the past month, it was not Luther or Gerard who had shown the most. Even with Luther's upgraded power, he was not sure he could measure up to Z. As if he were a protagonist of an anime, Z kept growing stronger at an exponential rate. Still in the foundation realm, even without actualizing his affinity and his energy, which only happened in the golden core realm, Z was playing around with space as if it took no effort to distort it at all. Although he was not the only one who had attained a space affinity, he was the only one who had mastered it to such an unbelievable level. He was now stronger and more lethal than any of them, yet unlike the rest, he did not gain a hardened and jagged aura from the month-long war. Instead, he retained his childlike innocence, his slightly introverted and shy tendencies, despite the fact that he had somehow become friends with almost all the workers at the inn. Without the music around to completely change how he behaved and fought, for a time, he had become extremely docile. After all, it was not in his nature to fight. He used the music to get him in the mindset to fight. Without it, he was handicapped. Until the last fight, in which he discovered the power of drums. Using only those, he unleashed the power of war drums. What happened after that? Well, since he was the one in charge of the mech, the results spoke for themselves. Among the other battalions who had seen him fight, and recently even among his own comrades, Z had gained a new nickname, though he himself was unaware. Behind his back, and in whisper, people spoke about the little devil who hid his true self behind a camouflage of youth and innocence. Not that anyone was complaining, since he was on their side. The members of the inn didn't even take it too seriously. But in the Allied forces, a file was compiled on the little devil, and sent up the command chain. It seemed even some superiors had begun to keep an eye on him. In the Crystal Realm, Lex continued to travel across the lands that seemed to never end. Since it was not safe to cultivate in such an environment, even inside his ship, Lex mostly took this time to review his arrays. He also sent his projections inside the library in the inn to begin studying. The lenses were revealing a lot of information to him that he didn't understand, which only showed the depth of his ignorance. He had to remedy that as soon as possible. Like this, another 2 weeks passed. After traversing various terrains and avoiding countless dangers, Lex arrived at the next spot he would take a teleportation formation. For some reason, despite his progress, an anxiety began to build in Lex's heart. He seemed to be feeling like he was running out of time. Chapter 667 Random Events. The area he arrived at was not the territory of some noble, but instead a trade city established by some kind of sect. The sect itself was quite mysterious, and not many knew the details of their practices or purpose. They were, however, quite accepting of everyone and everything as long as they obeyed the laws of their territory. Moreover, the sect would accept members of any race without compromising the unity that the sect members displayed. Why the members had so much unity was yet another mystery, and not one Lex was too interested in at the moment. Lex was too distracted by the growing tension he felt. At first, he thought that the anxiety was normal. After all, almost 2 months out of 6 had already passed, yet he was not anywhere close to his destination. Sure, the teleportation formations would surely help, and theoretically, he would arrive in the middle of the 4th month or early in the 5th month if all went well. This was the deduction based on the map. But there was no way of anticipating any problems he might encounter along the way. But as the anxiety grew, Lex reassessed the situation and concluded that it was a hint from his instincts. He began deducing what issues he would encounter and how he could circumvent them. In his mind, the feeling of running out of time was a result of him being on a tight schedule, which was the most logical deduction. After making a few contingency plans, he headed directly to the teleportation formation to continue his journey. As it happened, quite coincidentally, at the exact same time, various seemingly unrelated yet incredibly important events were taking place. In the Crystal Realm, at that very moment, Aegis, the crown prince of the Hum nation, seemed to be in the middle of a devastating battle. As the foremost genius the Hum nation had ever produced, there were very few instances where he was beaten so badly, and all of them were at the hands of his own father. This time was no exception. "Aegis, why are you doing this?" the king asked, somewhat exasperated. Was it not enough to rule the entire human race? Now he had to deal with parental issues as well. Around the two was a battlefield, littered with the corpses of Craven. They were deep within the territory lost by humans, so neither of them had reason to be there. Cornelius especially should not have been there. Why am I doing this? I think the question should be, why aren't you doing this? I am only seeking retribution for the losses we have suffered against the Craven, and taking back what is ours. I have told you, Aegis, you alone cannot face all the threats that humans face. The human race as a whole must become stronger. If they depend on the strength of a single man to keep them safe, they will once again fall as soon as that man disappears. Such a convenient answer, when it requires you to sit back and do nothing but let the humans die. Why train me so hard then, if you were never going to let me use my strength? You should have let me live in mediocrity. I am not doing nothing, I am raising the strength of the human race bit by bit. If you had obeyed my orders, and retrieved the cultivation technique of the true path, as I had told you to do, you would be doing the same. The cultivation technique of the true path? What's the point in pursuing a path that the majority of the human race cannot follow? That directly contradicts your statement about raising their strength as a whole. At this point, Aegis was screaming at his father. Years of bitterness and resentment had mixed in with the new frustrations he felt as he began exploring the truth of the Crystal Realm, under the hints of the Innkeeper. He had already developed a few theories of the truth, but each one hurt his innocent heart more than the next. Before Cornelius could answer, there was a flash of lightning, and with it, Aegis disappeared. In his stead, he left behind a few roaring words that echoed throughout the battlefield. Wash your neck, old man. If you have sold the human race, then I will be back to cut it off. Instead of being angered, Cornelius only sighed. It seemed his son was finally entering his rebellious phase. Elsewhere in the Crystal Realm, an army of Craven was slowly marching out once again. Yet what was different between this army and every other army that they sent out was that each and every member was an immortal. Hundreds of thousands of immortal Craven were on the move, their destination unknown. Back in the Origin Realm, quite a few significant events were happening at the same time as well. The Allied forces, meaning the various forces who under the order of the Henali combined their strength to combat the Fugan, were both unified in their mission, yet at the same time very disjointed in their chain of command. At least, that was the case with the Allied forces operating in the Swirling galaxy. As such, a lot of information often went missing, and entire records sometimes disappeared. This was usually not due to any sabotage, but just bad logistics. Among the millions of orders being processed each minute, a file containing the deployment orders of the Midnight Battalion suddenly disappeared, and in its place, another file appeared with completely different orders. At the same time, a file containing details of Z were copied and sent to an unknown destination, far away from the galaxy. On Earth, the battle for New York took a drastic turn when a group of immortals suddenly appeared and surrounded Marlowe. Yet facing certain death, Marlowe did not frown, and instead grinned like a madman. On his neck, the golden nano-talismans he was so proud of began to shine. The advantage of being known for stupidly intense brute strength was that people often forget that Marlowe was also a genius businessman, strategist and an overall intelligent person. For a long time he had been wondering if he could create a spiritual technique that mimicked the effects of a nuclear bomb. If he could, then he'd be able to convert it into a talisman, right? It was time to see the fruits of his efforts. In another place in the Origin realm, the fiery mammoths had officially sent a delegation to the central galaxy of the Jotun Empire, while unofficially they had begun to invade the galaxy neighboring theirs. True war was not their intention, so as long as their negotiations were concluded successfully, the situation would not escalate. In another planet in the Origin realm, Batet and Phallic wore a depressed look as they were escorted into a jail cell. At their cultivation level, they were more or less at the absolute peak strength that the Origin realm would naturally allow, so the identity of their captor was extremely mysterious. Even they did not know who it truly was, or what they wanted. After all, they had been overwhelmed the instant they were discovered. Somewhere else, in the Henali portal, someone sent out an invite for members to join a book reading club. The venue for their meeting would be the Midnight Inn. Elsewhere, far away from both the Origin realm and the Crystal realm, in one of the older and more complete realms, a group of 4 had encircled a single being. The group consisted of a true dragon, its massive red body radiating unbearable heat, a graven, a race equal to both dragons and celestials, a Henali, and Kilgore, a beast completely unique in the universe with no other members of its race besides itself. The being that was encircled was, surprisingly, a member of the celestial race. What was more unusual was that, despite the celestial being a Dowlord, looked like he was suffering from grievous wounds. "Do you know what you're doing?" the celestial asked in a hoarse voice. "Do you think you can afford the consequences of harming me? There is no race more unified than the celestials. None of you will escape. You should have thought of that before you messed with the Versailles Bank," said the Henali, showing no signs of remorse. "Are you serious? You're all dogs of a bank? Stupid celestial, don't you know the most important law in the universe? There is nothing more powerful than money," growled the dragon. "The celestial race will never let you go," the celestial said, anger and hatred filling his voice. "We shall see," replied Kilgore. Then, the group attacked once more. They did not ultimately kill the celestial, for that was easier said than done. They did, however, capture the celestial, and took him away. As soon as the celestial was delivered, their debts to the bank would be cleared. As for what happened afterwards, that was the bank's problem, not theirs. Chapter 668 Destiny Rank. Based on his previous experiences, Lex was prepared to face some kind of hurdle. But, unexpectedly, he faced no problems. He used the teleportation formation normally, like every other paying customer. When he arrived at his destination, he traveled for a few more days on his ship before once again arriving in a neighboring territory where he could once again use a teleportation formation. Such a trend continued for 1 more month. Not only did Lex not encounter any unusual problems, but he even came across a few people who were quite helpful. For example, he stumbled into a large caravan that was heading in the same direction as him. After paying a nominal sum, he accompanied them on their airship, which brought him to his destination a week ahead of schedule. Another time, he reached a city to discover that the teleportation formation of that city had recently been upgraded, and could take him much farther than was in his original plan. Moreover, the owner of that city seemed to be married to one of Jasmine's siblings. As such, upon discovering Lex's token, not only did he expedite his journey, he took no money from him either. Paying was not really a problem for Lex. As a result of his many trades at the inn, he had accumulated well over 100 million ordinary spirit stones. Paying a few thousand here or other made no difference to him. During his long periods of traveling, he would send a clone to study various topics at the library so as to increase his knowledge. Since the Innkeeper was perceived as a powerful entity, Lex had to learn as much as possible about as many things as possible. Fenrir could not do such a thing, but he was not bored either. Although Lex offered to leave him at the inn, he wanted to travel as well. Even when he could do nothing else, he enjoyed looking out at the passing scenery. During this period, Alexander once even asked Lex for help. Unfortunately, Lex could not afford any delays until he reached the Crystal Realm, and so had to tell him he was currently unable to help. He also got regular reports from Mary about the ongoing rumors at the inn, as Velma still compiled the files she used to submit to the Innkeeper. The thing that interested him most was that apparently the war on Earth had temporarily stopped, because apparently everyone was afraid that Marlowe would destroy the planet. There were no details to that rumor, yet somehow Lex did not doubt the authenticity of it. At the same time, he discovered that Roland, the once newspaper boy back in the Crystal Realm, had developed an extremely wide and vast information network that he used to supplement the Midnight Newsroom. Apparently, the entire realm was heading towards turmoil as no one was at peace. Lex did not pay attention to such things, as he had other concerns. The several-month-long event that he had held was coming to a close, which meant that naturally he would lose all the security the event brought with it. That naturally meant Lex needed to think of a new event. For now, he had the planning division propose some ideas, as he was too occupied to come up with and oversee a new event. The good thing was that the inn's income had been quite steady, and during this period his savings had come to 350 billion MP once again. Basically, there was more than enough MP to continue doing events for a long time. He also had to continue expanding the inn, as more and more guests were starting to come. Lately, developing a large underwater city had been added to his agenda, as a lot of aquatic beasts were beginning to visit, and the small lakes and rivers he had across the inn were beginning to get crowded. But these were just on the agenda for now. He would deal with all this once he had enough time. At the current rate, it would only take him a couple more weeks at max to reach the Crystal Nation, and then from there he imagined getting to Valesco should be easy. After all, he was expecting them to have a comprehensive transport system within their own territory. The reputation of the strongest and most developed race of the realm required at least that much. But it seemed that Lex's good luck eventually ran out. One day, while they were traversing a grassland in some unclaimed lands, during his last long-distance journey for this trip, something happened. The ship could not fly too high, and was traveling about 10 feet from the ground. Normally, that was enough to get them clear of any obstacles, but the grass in these grasslands was unusually high, so Lex's visibility was null. But such a mundane problem could not stop Lex, as he just used his spirit sense to keep an eye on his surroundings, ensuring they were traveling in the correct direction. But the distance his spirit sense could cover was ultimately limited, and he could not see too far away from himself. As such, he did not notice that he was heading directly towards a wall of rolling fog which seemed to be covering the grasslands. Perhaps, if his visibility was not blocked, he could have seen it coming. But even so, what could fog really even do? He could still navigate with his spirit sense, so it was unlikely he would have done anything. But the odd thing was, even when he got close enough for his spirit sense to interact with the fog, he was not able to detect it. In fact, even his instincts failed to warn him that anything was approaching him, whether it be harm or not. It was not until the ship flew into the fog that he actually noticed it. Immediately Lex became alert, though Fenrir looked at him with confusion. There seemed to be no threat, so why was Lex reacting like this? The answer was simple. Although Lex was heavily dependent on his instincts, he was well aware that his instincts could not react to things related to systems, so he never dropped his guard. Naturally, if there was one thing that his instincts failed to interact with, there could be others. Although the fog did not seem threatening at all, the fact that he was taken by surprise was a very alarming matter. In fact, even as he continued to travel through the fog, his spirit senses were unable to detect it. "There's something wrong," Lex began to tell Fenrir, when he noticed something else, which was even more alarming. The lenses could not detect the fog at all. In fact, even his right eye could not see the fog. Only his left eye, which had mutated, could see it. Lex raised his alertness to the maximum level even as he turned the ship around to immediately head back. He was not concerned for his safety, as he could always retreat to the inn. But if he retreated to the inn, every time he would return to the crystal realm, he would still be here. Ultimately, his quest to reach the crystal race would suffer. Yet despite his quick response, he was too late. The ship had been moving too fast, and even in the split second it took him to respond, it had already traveled through the fog, and come out the other side. The sound of a massive crowd surrounded Lex, as a bright light blinded him for a moment. When he recovered, he discovered that they had entered a completely new area. An artificial sun seemed to be shining a bright light, illuminating a vast, dry bowl-shaped canyon filled with millions of beings. In a single glance, Lex was able to spot humans, sentinels, poliads, trilops, the crystal race, and even the craven among the crowd. There were a few fights going on, which was extremely natural when hated enemies were suddenly brought together. The craven themselves had a warring nature, so every single craven was already fighting, and the extreme fighting prowess made it so they seemed to be winning. But even at a glance Lex knew that they would not survive long, for they were too outnumbered. After all, among the millions here, there were so many races that Lex had never even heard of. The craven were just a few compared to all the beings here. In the center of the canyon stood a massive tower built from white marble, and it was the only distinct feature here. Lex had no idea where he was, or what was happening, but the first thing he did was to check his connection to the inn. As expected, the connection was still there, for he heard the sound of a notification before he could even check. New notification: host has entered a space sealed by a Destiny rank spacelock. Teleportation facility unavailable. Chapter 669 Study. For once, Lex wasn't able to stop his expression from changing. Carefully, he read the notification once again. New notification: host has entered a space sealed by a Destiny rank spacelock. Teleportation facility unavailable. "Mary, can you hear me?" he asked inside his mind. "Of course. How can I help?" Lex did not reply immediately, for he was currently analyzing his situation. He was connected to the inn, still, but he was once again stuck in a situation where he could not teleport back. But unlike last time, where he was unable to teleport back because his system was too weak to carry out cross-realm teleportation easily, this time it was because of something that locked space. He analyzed his situation a bit further, not relying solely on his instincts, for they had already proved that they were not reliable in his current situation. He had been teleported mysteriously to an unknown location, alongside millions of others. Although he did not recognize many of the races, he had reason to believe that every one of them had come from the Crystal Realm. After all, while the Crystal Realm boasted 7 major races that controlled the majority of the realm, it did not mean there were no minor races. Subtle racial traits, as well as traces of different energy signatures, led Lex to believe that everyone had been pulled to this mysterious place from across the entire Crystal Realm instead of from just nearby where Lex was. He also noticed that the majority of the crowd seemed to be gathered either near the tower in the middle, or the edges of the canyon. Moreover, they were near these places only because there seemed to be some barrier keeping them at a distance. So that meant that they could neither leave the canyon nor enter the tower. Lex stopped his ship from moving forward, or he'd immediately reach the tower, which was not something he wanted. Getting off the ship, which was extremely prominent and eye-catching, and jumped to the ground. Until he had a better idea of the situation, he did not want to attract any attention. He swept his spirit sense and observed some of the crowd near him. The crowd's cultivation level seemed to vary, and ranged from mortals, all the way to nascent realm cultivators. It was reassuring that there were no immortals, but they could also just be far away from him or hiding. The fact that the crowd was so mixed meant that there really could be some immortals around. He listened to the conversations happening nearby, and thanked the system for the universal translator, for almost everyone was speaking in a different language entirely. It didn't take him long to gather that people had apparently been brought here only a few hours ago at most, yet no one knew anything. "Mary, I seem to be trapped somewhere again," Lex told, feeling like he was living through a bad joke. Why was it that the first time he encountered an area able to completely block out all teleportation was when he was in a rush? "That's strange," said Mary. "According to what I can tell, you should still be in the crystal realm. There shouldn't be an issue teleporting out. I'm being blocked by a destiny-level space block. Have someone start looking up relevant information about that wherever they can. Moreover, I'm going to describe the area I'm in to you as well. Have Velma look into any information regarding it from the crystal realm. Make sure to check old stories, myths, and legends so that all possibilities are covered." Lex described the area in great detail, though there really wasn't much to go on. He could only hope that he was caught in some usual and known phenomenon of the crystal realm so that he could safely make his way out. If there was no information about this place at all, there could only be two possibilities as far as Lex could tell. Either this was the first time such a thing was happening, or no one had ever made it out after entering this place. Once he passed Mary the information, he let her be so that she could oversee the search while he himself began to study the area some more. His instincts were not picking up on any danger around him, but that could possibly be because they were being suppressed somehow. He stayed away from all fights, and chose not to interact with anyone as he waited for a while. Fenrir too was looking around curiously, sniffing the air from time to time. He waited for a few hours, but nothing seemed to be happening, except that more and more beings appeared in the canyon. Eventually, he reached a conclusion that nothing significant would happen until either the canyon was completely filled, or that the canyon would continue to fill until something significant happened. Tired of waiting, he decided to make his way to the edge of the canyon first, to investigate the barrier keeping them in. Moving should not have been much of an issue, for all the fights had ended by now, and the Craven had been overwhelmed. Anyone else who was not smart enough to not antagonize millions of beings on their own also met a similar fate. Unfortunately, Lex's bad luck seemed to continue as a new Craven appeared in front of him just as he was making his way to the edge. The familiar, poisonous stench of the black slime covering their body irritated Lex, so he did not hesitate to extinguish the Craven by using evisceration before it could even attack. The Craven was only able to let out a single, painful squeal before it collapsed. The surrounding crowd was shocked at what happened, then moved to keep a distance. Whether they wanted distance from the poisonous slime or the intimidating Lex who killed a Craven with one look, could not be accurately determined. Chapter 670 Web. While Lex's feat of killing with a single look was intimidating to most, it in no way made him out to be overwhelmingly powerful. For example, Trollops within their own territories were vastly more powerful than their realm should allow. But the few Trollops here had been plucked from their territories and dropped in the middle of nowhere, putting them at a severe disadvantage. Usually, even if a Trollop left their territory, they would at least be able to summon some support from their territories. Yet now that they were in this mysterious place, they were completely cut off, and were at their weakest. But not everyone had such clear weaknesses, for example, the few members of the crystal race who were present. Similar to how the crowd gave Lex a wide berth, so too did they avoid those ridiculously overpowered beings. As a race with guaranteed immortality, they had countless geniuses who revolutionized cultivation, or really any field that they were interested in, and then continued to do so since they wouldn't really die. Moreover, due to the biology of the crystal race, they really never suffered from depression as a result of their long, never-ending lives. Sure, they got bored from time to time, and they would treat that by sleeping for a few eons. As such, the cultivation system of the crystal race was extremely well developed, and since they could transmit information extremely easily, each member understood how to cultivate perfectly. Basically, there was no such thing as a weak member of the crystal race, only ridiculously strong freaks of nature, and geniuses among those who surpassed all common sense. Then, there were always a few geniuses in every race, some of whom had made their presence known in the canyon. Suffice to say, Lex declared himself as a powerhouse with his single move, but he was not the only one. Not that Lex really even cared about any of that. The barrier blocking the edges of the canyon was being heavily bombarded with countless attacks and weapons, so it was quite a lively scene, at least to Lex. Beasts and creatures of all kinds howled and screamed. Fangs and fists attacked the invisible blockade. Rocks, bullets, and balls of energy were all hurled or launched at it, spreading chaos and carnage in the surroundings, but the barrier itself did not even ripple. The calm and casual Lex seemed an anomaly amidst such madness, but he merely stood there calmly as he looked at the barrier right in front of him. None of his senses could detect the barrier, save his sense of touch when he pressed his arm against the barrier, and his left eye that saw a massive wall of flowing fog. After probing the barrier with basic physical strength, then channeling his normal spirit energy into the wall, Lex decided to take things more seriously. He used impervious hands, and immediately felt the difference. The fog, which previously acted as an impenetrable wall, immediately became soft. He could dig his fingers into it, and even pull some fog out, though as soon as he tried to do it, his instincts immediately screamed danger. Fortunately, he stopped in time, and did not allow his impulsive thoughts to land him in trouble. He tried to see if he could achieve something by digging his hand into the fog, but the same sense of danger crashed down on him as soon as he tried. Ultimately, Lex decided to let it be, and go investigate the tower. Hoping for a quick and easy way out was wishful thinking to begin with. If he wanted to exit, he would have to play by the rules of this place, though he did not understand them yet. When he approached the tower, he discovered, through his left eye, that the barrier surrounding it was not made of fog. Instead, it seemed like an intricate web which would react to each and every person or attack made contact with it. He noticed that sometimes the complex web blocking everyone's path would sometimes thin in reaction to certain beings, but never enough to reveal a path. Instead, when it was attacked, the web would thicken and multiply, increasing the complexity of the barrier. It seemed that they were supposed to somehow figure out how to cross the barrier on their own. When Lex touched the web, it seemed to thin as well, yet not nearly enough to cross. So he tried impervious hands. This time, he discovered that he could easily move the web with his hands as he wished, either creating an opening or making the barrier thicker and stronger. For a moment, he considered whether to create a massive opening and let everyone enter, or just enter on his own. He did not know what the tower held, so it was a risk. He could either be bringing reinforcements with himself if a terrible foe awaited them, or be bringing in competition if the tower led to some treasure. It all came down to how much confidence he had in himself, and how much of a risk he was willing to take. He looked at Fenrir, as if asking the puppet's opinion, and saw only excitement and eagerness. "Well, I hope I don't regret this then," he murmured as he pushed aside the web just enough to create a small opening. Before anyone could notice, he grabbed Fenrir and jumped through the hole, passing through. The moment his hands left the web, the hole disappeared and the web regained its normal appearance. Immediately, the millions of beings trapped in the canyon fixed their gaze on Lex, and countless beings jumped after him to try and follow him, but to no avail. A stampede occurred as everyone wanted to try for themselves. Countless hateful and angry gazes fixed on Lex, as if he was stealing from their ancestors' graves. Yet none of that was of any concern to him as he walked into the tower. A part of him was glad he had put on his new, defensive suit. Whatever was about to happen, at least he was glad he didn't have to worry about suddenly becoming naked again. Chapter 671 Tower. There was no opening on the tower that could serve as a door, so Lex just approached its surface with the intention to see how impervious hands reacted to it, but the moment he touched the tower he disappeared. The millions of beings watching were further aggravated as a feeling of falling behind filled them. Though most of them did not know what this place was or what approaching the tower entailed, it was clear that it was the only way to get out of here. A few, however, clearly knew what this place was, or perhaps it only appeared that way since they maintained their calm even as the canyon was whipped up into a frenzy. It was a strange coincidence that all those who seemed to be in the know were from the crystal race, though not all members of the crystal race seemed to be privy to this knowledge. But despite the fact that Lex already disappeared, no other change seemed to occur in the canyon. More and more beings began to be dropped in, slowly filling up the entire canyon. Lex, who had vast experience in teleportation, felt the familiar sensation of being moved through space, though this time was not instantaneous. A special kind of energy seemed to cover him, protecting him from the turbulence as this teleportation seemed to take a long time. Unable to move, as his body was stuck in the position in which he touched the tower, he decided to take this time to study the sensations he felt while being teleported. Since space was apparently one of his affinities now, he should learn how to make use of it. If he only knew how much progress Z had made despite having a lesser affinity than himself, Lex might have blushed from shame. Fortunately, or unfortunately, they were as far from one another as they could get. Using his spirit sense, soul sense, and instincts, Lex continued to study space for what felt like hours before he finally appeared in what felt like an ancient yet grand courtroom. Lex immediately began to study the room, failing to notice that for the first time, his connection to his system was suppressed. If he tried to contact Mary, for the first time, he would be unable to do so. Everything in the massive hall seemed to be carved out of stone, from the floor to the walls and pillars, to the endless intricate designs etched over every inch of the room. In front of Lex, in the far corner of the room, was a kind of throne, once again carved out of stone. On each side of the throne were smaller chairs, as if to accommodate aides or advisors for whoever sat in the middle. Despite the primitive impression the room gave, it also projected feelings of grandeur and an ancient power. It was not easy to make Lex feel like he was being judged, since he was the one usually doing the judging, but standing in this place, he felt like a mere plebeian waiting for his sentence. The cold, hard stone of the room reminded him of the days where he was just a mortal, and his existence was fragile. Lex narrowed his eyes as he began circulating his spirit energy, his determination fighting against the oppressive aura of this place. Regardless of the circumstances, he would not accept being belittled. Although he had started out only pretending to be someone powerful and significant to play the role of the innkeeper, he had slowly come to accept that he was far from ordinary. He did not know if it was a good thing or bad, but he had developed a bit of pride. Even knowing his cultivation level was much lower than that of many, and that his existence could be a matter of no more than a whim for such beings, he could not keep himself from developing such a mindset. As if rewarding his reaction, the aura in the room disappeared, and the chair became inviting instead of intimidating. It was as if the room was made specifically for his coronation, and he was to be awarded great honors as soon as he took his rightful place on his throne. Lex was not really swayed by the changing pressures of the room, but as nothing else seemed to be happening, he approached it. Soft, distant whispers seemed to fill the room as Lex walked, initially incomprehensible. Yet the further he walked, the clearer the voices became, up until he reached the throne, and the hall was filled with voices of various political figures, discussing the future of some sacred civilization. Lex looked around and saw nothing, even as he felt people were talking right next to where he stood. Unable to stop his curiosity, Lex sat down and saw as countless figures appeared in front of him, garbed in ancient cotton gowns in golden and silver colors. They wore basic, handmade jewelry, yet the impression they gave was of opulence and luxury. Lex noticed almost immediately that their discussions never seemed to reach any conclusion, and they continued to debate quite audibly as if their very purpose was to make Lex aware of the situation based on the content of their conversation. Simultaneously, a stream of information entered Lex's mind. The White Tower he was in was an artifact that had existed from time immemorial and had played a role in the development of the entire universe itself. The origin of the tower was unknown, and the exact reason for its existence was also unknown. What mattered was that the function of the tower was known, and in fact was directly transmitted to Lex. Any time a group, or an organization, or a company, or a country, civilization, or race accumulated enough merit and reached a turning point in their history that would either lead them to the pinnacle of success or to an unprecedented nadir, the tower would automatically activate. There was no explanation for what this merit was or how it was accumulated. What was explained was that the tower's purpose was to help the specific group as much as possible. Moreover, it would not randomly send people over. Each and every person who had been summoned to the canyon was specifically chosen by the tower, for they would have the exact specific skills or necessary expertise to help specific groups. But just because someone had been chosen did not mean they would automatically be able to help. Entering the tower was the first hurdle. If someone wasn't able to enter, they would stay at the canyon till the specific group that needed their help would go through whatever situation they were stuck in. The second hurdle was actually being able to help the situation once the tower brought them into the specific scenario. If they were not able to overcome this situation, they would never be able to return. The only way of returning was to help his assigned group successfully go through the turning point in their history, or survive the repercussions of failure. Of course, he was not randomly hurled into an unknown situation. The tower arranged for an appropriate identity for Lex, so that he could seamlessly involve himself in the present circumstances. Lastly, it wasn't as if there was no reward for the people the tower had summoned. If Lex was able to successfully navigate the situation and return, the tower would provide him with something he sorely needed. There was too much about this situation and the tower that made no sense to Lex, but there was nothing he could do about it for now. Instead, he focused on his new identity. As it turned out, the identity that Lex got from the tower was the leader of a rising nation. Information about this nation, and the general information about the world was automatically provided to Lex. Moreover, information about the turning point was even specifically given to him. This country, which was quite similar to ancient Egypt, was facing an unprecedented danger that they were incapable of overcoming. The country had formed a unique form of governance where their leaders and leader candidates were orphans, trained from birth to rule justly and without bias. There was no concept of inheriting power, at least as far as the ruler was concerned. Moreover, their strict moral and cultural values made it so the country had excellent security and living conditions. As a result of a government and ruler who genuinely wished to benefit the country instead of accumulating their own power, the country rose up quickly, and their quick rise was also what attracted trouble. With insufficient military and wealth that did not match their global status, they had been targeted by their 3 neighboring countries. Their existing leader had been assassinated, as well as all the orphans who were being trained. As per the scenario set by the tower, Lex took the identity of the lone survivor who qualified to take the ruler's position. He had, just now, been coronated, and in a few hours representatives for all 3 neighboring countries would arrive to offer condolences and aid during this difficult time. The impending negotiations would forever determine the fate of this fledgling country. Lex smiled. Was this supposed to be a challenge? Chapter 6, 72 Plans. Having understood the situation, Lex suppressed his curiosity and concern about the tower and began to absorb information about his surroundings. A quick scan showed that everyone in the room was in the golden core realm, though their cores seemed weak and frail in comparison to even normal cultivators, let alone Lex. There were a few soldiers who looked extremely intimidating and had decent cultivations, but even those were in the minority. Most guards who stood around the room were in the Foundation realm, and even then Lex could tell they were far from outstanding. Any casual Foundation realm cultivator from Earth could suppress them one-on-one easily. Although no one said so, Lex drew the conclusion that this country had a terrible cultivation heritage. It remained to be seen if this was the case in its neighboring countries as well, or just here. Suddenly a thought occurred to Lex. Was he still in the crystal realm? If he had to guess, he would say he wasn't, as the ambient spirit energy was quite weak comparatively. Then he began focusing on the conversations the people were having. The way in which they were conversing was extremely artificial, as they were discussing minute details about each ministry they oversaw. It was clear that, through their conversations, they were indirectly providing information to Lex about the various factors of the empire. The most significant factor that Lex immediately realized was the military truly was lacking in this country. Due to excellent social services and economic support, scarcely was there anyone in the entire country who could not achieve a stable and successful life. In the scenario where everyone could easily achieve a comfortable life without much pressure, why would anyone be willing to endure the arduous life of a soldier? Only those who genuinely wanted to protect the country would take such a path. Already he could tell this would be his greatest hurdle, as the martial incompetence of the country was more or less an established fact and known widely. After learning some of the details, Lex diverted his attention elsewhere. He was hoping they would have some geographic advantage, only to learn that most of the country consisted of plateaus or plains, as it was at the feet of a long mountain range inside one of the neighboring countries. While that provided a vast amount of fertile lands, there were few natural barriers except rivers, which was not really a problem for cultivators. As time passed, and Lex learned more about this country, he realized that, without external intervention, this country was set to be a treasure chest, constantly raided and looted by external forces. He did not even need to spare a single brain cell to come up with countless examples of colonists who occupied rich fertile lands, all to loot and pillage them. If anything, he could not understand why this country had not suffered such a disaster before, and was even allowed to grow to the level it had already reached. After all, it already had 3 neighbors who could invade their lands. To sate his curiosity, he began listening to the guy discussing the general history of their land. Slowly and steadily, he got an overview of the entire situation and came to the conclusion that there should be no way for it to overcome this crisis under normal circumstances. This country, which was called Farrago, was a piece of juicy meat dangling in front of a group of hungry street dogs. The only possible redeeming factor was that the neighboring countries were not overwhelmingly powerful either, and had conflicts of their own to resolve. It was only comparative to Farrago that they were more powerful. Adorning a look of absolute calm, Lex closed his eyes and allowed his figure to project confidence to all the various ministers in the room. In his mind, he was devising various strategies on how to overcome the situation. A lot of how he behaved would depend on the representatives and their respective plans. Previously, Lex used to form a few plans in which he would take advantage of people's psychological blind spots and manipulate them based on having them form assumptions. But now, due to how fast and the vast experience he had accumulated in handling people, he could form multi-layered plans and various contingencies. Suddenly opened his eyes and looked at an old man who was in charge of the personal guard for the king. The man looked like he had aged considerably, and though he stood firm in his post and exuded an aura of bloodlust, it was easy to determine that he had taken the assassination of the previous king as a personal failure. According to Lex's analysis, the old man had not purposefully failed in his duty, but the enemy had just outmaneuvered him. He could still be trusted. Using his spirit sense, Lex passed the old man a few orders. Surprise and hesitation painted his face when he heard his orders, attracting the attention of everyone in the room, but he did not voice any of his doubts. He simply bowed to Lex and quickly left the hall to carry out his orders. Perhaps before he would have offered resistance and counsel, but he had lost a lot of confidence lately, and could not bring it in himself to disobey orders. Lex once again closed his eyes and resumed planning. The envoys from the neighboring countries would arrive soon, and everyone was waiting on pins and needles for their arrival. If Lex had arrived a little earlier, he would never have gathered everyone to wait for the arrival of a mere delegation. It put them in a weaker position. But it was already too late for that. He would salvage the situation as best as he could. In the meantime, he was already compiling a comprehensive strategy for military reform. A few more hours passed, and the sun was nearing the horizon. The sky was filled with hues of orange and yellow, forming a beautiful tapestry hanging over the city, which was engulfed in a mood of despair. The dichotomy of the situation was absolutely tragic. All the ministers, who had been waiting all day now, looked irritated and miserable and allowed a sense of helpless frustration to fill them. It was clear that while they all were noble people, focused on the benefit of their nation, they had little to no experience facing real hardship. The door to the hall opened, and a messenger swiftly approached Lex and passed him a simple scroll. After taking a look, Lex nodded to dismiss the messenger, then turned his attention back to the ministers. "All of you, take a seat. Make yourselves comfortable." Confusion and hesitation filled their eyes, as they looked at one another, trying to determine if anyone knew what was going on. "That was not a request, that was an order," Lex said in a cold, firm tone. "I do not have time to elaborate on my plans, nor can I afford for a poor performance from you to compromise the outcome. So, for now, all of you must simply obey my orders instantly and without question. The time for you to use your intellect will come later. For now, all I require is obedience." This was far from Lex's usual style of doing things, as he was usually very considerate of his underlings. But the way he saw it, being firm was not the same as mistreating his subordinates. Moreover, he did not have a comprehensive understanding of their personalities, and so he could not include them in his plans. As such, their only role would be to serve as an audience. Upon hearing Lex's command, and feeling his subtle aura of oppression, everyone obeyed and took a seat. But just sitting did not change the fact that they looked extremely tense, and a glance was enough to determine their true thoughts. That was where Lex's various experiences came into play. In the crystal realm, back when he was in the academy, he was first introduced to the complicated ways in which nobles and higher-leveled cultivators used spiritual energy and aura to build and hold prestige. In the way that mundane humans wore regal suits and dresses, and styled their hair, applied makeup and used fragrances to establish a persona for themselves, so too did cultivators use their additional capabilities to embellish their image. A person's aura itself could have a scent which other cultivators could sense. The flow of energy in a room could affect its inhabitants the way a breeze could affect people on a hot summer day. Each and everything played a role in establishing oneself. Lex normally did not need to think of such things, as his host attire would automatically do all of these when he presented himself as the innkeeper. In fact, the host attire probably even took care of various such subtleties that Lex was not even aware of. But currently the host attire could not help him. It was fortunate then that he had long been studying these things so that he could seamlessly merge into higher cultivator society if he ever needed to. Chapter 673: A Great Show. While Lex was planning out how to fulfill the requirements of the tower and get out of it, the inn seemed to be running well on autopilot. All the staff was well trained and Mary knew what to do in most situations. Moreover, it had only been a short while since the connection between Lex and the system was blocked, so the chances of something going wrong were abysmally low. Unfortunately, sometimes it did not matter how low the chances were. After the previous star rank upgrade, countless immortals had received just the push they needed to move up in rank. That had naturally led to a reign of lightning tribulations. There were naturally other tribulations, but they were not as prominent as the lightning ones. But it had been months now, so the frequency of tribulations had dropped drastically. The tribulations had not, however, completely disappeared. This was because the process of cultivation at higher levels took a much longer period. It would not be surprising if there continued to be tribulations for many years still just based on the previous star rank increase. Even among the tribulations, there were various levels. For example, the tribulation that Ragnar had faced had been the most devastating so far, due to his incredibly high cultivation level. Now, it just so happened that mere minutes after Lex's connection was cut, one such tribulation once again started to arrive. Lex had already reinforced all the tribulation rooms with formations and protections similar to the one Ragnar faced, hoping it would be enough to contain the destruction. Now, it would be put to the test. Lex's spirit energy swept through the hall as he used various spiritual techniques to influence the environment. Slowly, the overwhelmed ministers began to notice that, despite their own lamentable state, the atmosphere in the room began to change. Soon, it no longer felt like this was a hall where they were waiting for a death sentence. Instead, it felt like this was a grand hall, befitting a great and glorious king, one who was the ruler of a strong and prosperous nation. Instead of handles and chandeliers, the room had large metal bowls which contained fire to light up the room. As if it had been injected with the perfect kindling, the flames grew into a larger blaze that nearly overflowed from the bowl, projecting its brilliant orange light across the hall. A breeze seemed to blow in the hall, taking away the stale air and bringing in with a subtle scent of vanilla. It also seemed to blow away any and all dust and dirt that had accumulated in the hall, leaving it immaculate. The ministers watched bewildered as the changes swept the hall, and were taken by complete surprise when the energy in the hall gathered around themselves as well. Their appearances seemed to change subtly. Their wrinkles seemed to fade or disappear entirely, and their skin seemed to tighten. Though the skin did not suddenly become clear, it did look fresher. Their clothes did not change, but somehow seemed to appear more grand than mere moments ago. Even their auras changed, and they went from being anxious and concerned to being completely relaxed and yet dignified. The hall, previously a theater where a performance of nations was to take place, had become the court befitting someone who was to be called Majesty. The next change was amongst the soldiers. They stood at guard with their backs to the walls, facing the hall. Of the entire group, they were actually who needed Lex's help the least. Weak though their cultivation may have seemed in Lex's eyes, it was not for a lack of resolution or bravery. Their rough, tanned skin, their rippling, chiseled muscles, their firm, focused eyes all spoke of men who had faced the trials of battle. Amongst their own ranks, where everyone had cultivation techniques of a similar quality, they were champions. As such, they did not really need much bolstering. But Lex did it anyway. Their auras strengthened till they became suffocatingly overwhelming, and then he suppressed it to their bodies. If no one looked at them, they would not even know of their existence. But if one looked in their eyes, they would feel the full force of their augmented aura. Some of these effects had been brought about by the various spiritual techniques Lex learned, and some, such as the breeze carrying vanilla scent, had been done by arrays. Even though Lex had learned about such things, he had not gone into too much detail, so for now, this is all he could really do. Although it might seem impressive to an outsider, he knew that those who considered themselves true nobles among cultivators took things to levels unimaginable to an outsider. But for Farrago and its neighboring countries, which seemed somewhat lacking in regard to cultivation, this much should already be more than enough. When the envoys arrive, do not say anything, or interfere in any way, Lex commanded, his voice still just as firm as before. Just pretend as if you are watching an interesting performance. Lex swept his gaze over the ministers to judge if there was still any hesitation or reluctance in them, but found that his performance had thoroughly subdued them, and that though they were still confused, they chose to obey without delay. Lex nodded gently. Though they had been made to wait nearly an entire day for the envoys, they had arrived precisely during the golden hour, making everything the sun touched even more pleasant to look at. Lex looked down at himself and found that, instead of his suit, he was wearing a majestic robe of gold and white. Although he preferred his own attire, he supposed being dressed according to the situation was more important. The doors leading to the hall suddenly produced a loud creak before being swung open by the guards stationed outside. Presenting the envoys from Solis, Javi, and Nefario, he said loudly, announcing the identities of those who were arriving. 3 men, 2 who could be considered a little chubby while the third looked quite slim and fit, walked in followed by a number of retainers. The group had 3 distinct dressing styles, so it was easy to distinguish which countries they belonged to. Based on the knowledge he had acquired, Lex could easily identify which group belonged to which country. Normally, based on his knack for hospitality, Lex would have stood up and warmly greeted these new guests. But, considering his current circumstances, he did not. In fact, not only did he continue to sit, though he of course maintained excellent posture, he also tracked the group's arrival with his eyes, an amused smile on his lips. "Forgive us, Your Majesty, for arriving so late. We came as soon as we heard of the awful attack," said one of the chubby men, the representative for Solis. Before the man could continue his, no doubt, prepared spiel, Lex interrupted him. "There is no need for apologies. Your poor infrastructure and lack of roads is common knowledge. The fact that you still managed to arrive so quickly speaks greatly of how you must have rushed to arrive after the incident." Lex's voice was quite calm and even had a hint of praise, as if he was complimenting a child on trying his best. The envoy from Solis froze momentarily, as his eyes bulged. Despite also being in the Golden Core himself, it took almost an entire second for him to get over the shock of open insult he had just suffered, as well as the veiled condescension. It was true that their countries did not have many roads linking their various cities, especially if they were far from one another. So then, how could they possibly have roads heading towards Farrago? All they had was one major road that was used for trade. After all, cultivators could easily make do without such things, so there was no need to waste money investing in them. The fact that mortals suffered greatly as a result was of little to no consequence. The comment about their quick arrival was the most shocking. Though the king claimed to be praising them for their quick arrival, it was a fact that they could not have arrived so quickly if they had indeed departed after the incident happened. He was clearly making fun of their poor attempts to veil their involvement, or knowledge of, the incident. The reason why he was shocked the most was because this was not the reaction he was expecting from Farrago. Not only had they suffered a devastating loss in terms of leadership, they were in a weaker position, especially when facing all three countries at the same time. They should have been the most cautious, yet instead their king immediately broached the most sensitive topic as soon as they arrived, completely unafraid of offending them. As envoys, they were naturally smart and trained in diplomacy. They immediately realized something was amiss, and that they might have possibly fallen into some trap. It was at that moment that the three envoys suddenly realized that in the hall they had an audience. All the ministers of Farrago had gathered, and were sitting in the corners of the room, as if they had come to watch a great show. Chapter 674 Bandits. Countless thoughts surfaced in their minds as the three envoys tried to explain what was happening around them. Though they were shocked, and they could not explain why the newly appointed king was acting so fiercely, it was a little early to jump to conclusions. As it was, they were the ones who held the upper hand in the situation, for all three countries had a united stance on the matter. Regardless of whatever they were plotting, the downfall of Farrago was already determined. The only thing that remained to be decided was how costly it would be for the three countries. When we heard of the situation, we spared no expense to hurry to your aid, said the envoy from Nefario, the slim man of the three. After all, with the limited military of Farrago, no one was certain if you would be able to survive without aid if you suffered more of such attacks. Lex's smile widened just as bit as his gaze fixed on the man speaking. Compared to his companions, the envoy from Nefario was clearly more competent and quick-witted. His explanation for Lex's previous remark pointed out Farrago's weak military, as well as the fact that its current existence relied on the three countries' grace. The moment they decided to attack Farrago, it would not survive. In fact, the whole point of this meeting was an attempt to get Farrago to peacefully allow the military of the neighboring countries to enter, and peacefully hand over its cities. All of this would be done under the guise of protection and military aid. This way the three countries would not have to invest in a campaign against Farrago and win all the prizes, while the current king himself would be allowed some concessions for allowing such an easy handover. He could become a minor noble or something, and live out his days in luxury. The way the envoy saw it, the king was not trying to trap or attack them, but was merely building up his own importance before the negotiations began. To Lex, however, this was only an amusing attempt to maintain control. He had no intention of playing by the rules. Yes, indeed, the security in Farrago is atrocious lately. There are bandits' attacks and raids everywhere. I'm glad to see you arrived without incident. Despite the envoy's goading, Lex retained his casual tone, and did not hesitate to lace his concern with sarcasm. While the ministers were confused, for Farrago never had any problems with bandits, the envoys too were confused. The king blatantly admitting to having to suffer at the hand of bandits was actually weakening their position. But the thing was, Lex never intended to negotiate to begin with. Relying on the mercy of others would forever mire Farrago in a weak position. The solution he had come up with to resolve this issue was not to intimidate them, or even get on their good side. It was instead to turn them against one another. The reason he had mentioned bandits was because of a plan he had set into motion even before the envoys arrived. He ordered his general to have his strongest unit dress up as bandits, and on the way back ambush the envoy's party as they return. But how could the strategy Lex took so much time thinking up be so simple and straightforward? It would be obvious to anyone that the bandits were not really so due to their strength and training. The real plan would be implemented when the envoys, who would just barely push the bandits back, would actually discover by accident that the bandits were actually soldiers from Heavy. But then again, just that would not be enough to throw suspicion their way, so Lex had already arranged for some of the retainers from Heavy to be poisoned, and to make it look like normal travel fatigue. The envoy of Heavy would naturally have to stay back until his retainers recovered, conveniently missing out on the ambush. Now, with some evidence and a convenient coincidence keeping the Heavy envoy from being attacked, the suspicion pointing towards him would be greater. But suspicion was not enough, he needed the others to be certain of their guess. It was at this point, one might beg the question, why was Lex targeting Heavy instead of Solis or Nefario? Weren't they all equally susceptible to taking the blame? Did he then choose the country randomly? The answer was no. He had targeted Heavy specifically because of the complex socio-political history of the region. Heavy shared a border not only with Farrago, but also with Nefario and another country. Up until recently, relations between Heavy and Nefario were tense because there was a blazing iron mine close to their borders. They often had skirmishes and small disputes to contest the ownership of that mine, until it was eventually completely depleted. With bad history already existing between them, all Lex needed to do was plant the idea that Heavy was secretly conspiring with Farrago against Nefario, at the expense of Solis. Then, through a series of coincidences and misunderstandings, he could sit and watch as the three countries tore each other up. All the while, they would not be concerned about Farrago, which was apparently continuously being weakened by bandits. They could take care of it when they settled matters between themselves. That would give Lex enough time to begin implementing a series of military reforms which would not only strengthen their army and martial culture in the country, but ensure that full control of the army stayed with the king and did not fall into the hands of some generals. Of course, Lex was not going to be around to see all this. He would just make the plan and set the wheels in motion, which would lead to the dominance of Farrago in the region in close to a couple of decades. Even if you have bandits, seeing us flying the colors of our countries, they would never dare to attack our delegation, the envoy from Solis said boldly and with arrogance. Indeed. They would be completely crazy to attack all three of you together, said Lex, with a soft smile. Chapter 675 Finishing Up. Your Majesty, clearly the situation in Farrago is extremely dire, said the envoy from Nefario, wearing a solemn look. Let us not waste time and directly deal with the matter at hand. A hidden force has taken action against Farrago and assassinated your predecessor, as well as many of your peers. While we currently suspect demonic cultivators from a rising demonic sect, we cannot deal with that matter until the situation here is stabilized. You yourself have claimed that Farrago is even having problems with bandits. The situation is going from bad to worse. The noble nation of Nefario is already dealing with the savage beasts that constantly invade us from the neighboring mystic forest. We cannot afford a neighbor becoming a den of criminals and demonic cultivators, as that will cause us to divert resources away from the forest. As such, the royal family had decided to act preemptively. So long as you give us permission, we can have 3 battalions cross the border and help stabilize the situation here. We can root out the criminal element and investigate the demonic cultivators, all while keeping the citizens of Farrago safe. The nation of Heavy is also ready to pledge 2 battalions. Solis can also send in 4. Fear not, we will not allow evil to fester in these prosperous lands. How magnanimous, said Lex, as if he was really praising them. Yet the look on his face, and the tone of his voice said otherwise. I'm afraid even if I were to accept your help, it would not be so simple for your armies to come in, he said, looking at the envoy from Nefario. It seems a mortal trader who was using the river to cross into Heavy transporting a shipment of red lily powder was attacked by bandits as well. As a result, the entire shipment was destroyed and the river was polluted with the powder. The entire river has become a quarantine zone and the cleanup process will take a while. Although the river was heading from Farrago to Havy, it crossed the border of Farrago before heading there, so the excuse was quite believable. Moreover, red lily powder was an extremely unstable compound which was used in the production of various medicines, but on its own was quite poisonous. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But besides making medicine, red lily powder could also be used to make an extremely strong irritant which was known to drive beasts crazy and attack with abandon. Nefario, as a nation, was quite sensitive to anything that could aggravate beasts, for they faced attacks from wild beasts throughout the year due to the border they shared with the mystic forest, a forest that was home to an endless number of wild beasts. In truth, there was no such contamination, at this point at least. Lex had ordered the powder spilled into the river, also through his newly established bandit unit. Although agriculture in Farrago would suffer because of this, so would Havy. Moreover, Nefario would begin to suspect Havy was creating those irritants to aggravate beast attacks against it. It was a win-win. This time, Lex suppressed his smile, as he was supposed to have no idea of the insinuations of the powder, and was merely pointing something out. The envoy had to believe he uncovered this plot on his own. With such a start, the meeting with the envoys went on for hours. Though they made no headway with Farrago itself, countless conspiracies had been subtly uncovered during this time, slowly affecting the unity that the envoys came with. They studied one another from the corners of their eyes, and took mental notes to report as soon as they returned. By now, they were not even thinking of the merit they could gain by bringing this information home. Instead, they were worried about the imminent war that seemed to have been brewing on their borders, all without their knowledge. The envoy from Solis, which was the richest of all the countries here, slowly began to believe that in truth, Farrago, Nefario, and Havy all were secretly working against it, and in actuality planned to ambush the 4 battalions they were originally planning on sending. The ministers, on the other hand, mostly had no idea what was happening. They only kept wondering if they had missed out on some important news, for they had no idea about half the things the king mentioned. Like this, the first day of negotiations ended, and the envoys were escorted, separately, to their quarters. A full night would be plenty of time for them to reflect on what they had heard today, and begin drawing conclusions. In the meantime, Lex inspected the poison to be sent towards the Havy retainers. It seemed quite potent. With a smile, he nodded his head, and then returned to the hall to have a meeting with the ministers. During this night, he had to pass on the plan for developing their country for the next few years so the direction of their development would focus on the right path. As for the continuation of the meeting with the envoys in the morning, it would never happen. When they woke up, they would be delivered news that due to the declining situation, Farrago had entered under martial law, and the king had already left to command his armies against the bandits. That would be enough for them to understand that Farrago did not intend on cooperating, leaving Tem no option but to depart, and quickly. The reason Lex was doing all this so quickly was because he was certain that as soon as he set things up enough, and put all his plans in motion, the tower would consider his task complete and pull him back. He did not have time to waste on such stupid things as babysitting a country. Speaking of which, he wondered what happened to Fenrir. He had entered the tower with it, but had been separated afterwards. Was it also sent to save someone by the tower? Chapter 676 Providence. A full moon illuminated the land with its gentle, silver light, yet the massive trees in the forest blocked the light from reaching the forest floor. Only a few scant, thin streaks of light reached the ground. Shadows flickered through the silver streaks, one after another, as a wolf pack ran through them. An abnormal silence took hold of the forest wherever the wolf pack passed, as even the crickets singing in the night froze out of fear. A war for territory was being waged between the bark-brown wolves and the winged leopards, and the collateral damage had already claimed countless lives. Such a thing was quite common in the mystic forest, for the forest had an unusual effect on beasts. Often, a seemingly mundane and ordinary beast would randomly undergo a mutation or unlock a deeply hidden bloodline, thus becoming more powerful. With its new status, it would naturally have to expand its territory, and would begin a search for a suitable area. Survival of the fittest was the rule that dictated the forest, and with the forest's perpetual augmentation of beasts randomly, the fittest were often tested. One would think that with such never-ending fights, the population of beasts in the forest would plummet, but for some reason, that was far from the truth. In fact, the population of beasts would often grow so high despite the constant fights that beasts would be forced out of it, and end up invading the neighboring lands occupied by humans. None of that mattered to the wolves, though. Whatever secrets the forest held, whether it was why the population of the beasts never fell, or why some beasts randomly grew stronger, could not concern them even if they unlocked a higher intelligence. Such concerns would only bother those who did not have to struggle to survive every day. What did it matter if there was some conspiracy at large, if they could not survive to see tomorrow? The fight with the invading winged leopards had put a lot of pressure on them, and their pack almost considered migrating somewhere else. But then, a new, younger and more powerful pack leader arrived. Under its leadership, not only did their own casualties dwindle, they even began to retake some of the territories they had lost. At the front, Fenrir led the way, its abilities muting the sounds of the pack as it traversed the forest. Although the wolves in the pack it was leading were not dumb, Fenrir's own intelligence far surpassed them. Despite its inability to speak, Fenrir had a deep understanding of strategies and formations. Moreover, it was constantly being influenced by Lex, so it knew how to frustrate its enemies to death. But, for once, it had surpassed Lex in a certain aspect. While Lex had sped through his mission designated by the tower, ensuring the best outcome in the least amount of time, Fenrir was taking its time. That was because it noticed something as soon as it became the pack leader. The worship and obedience of its pack had somehow activated Fenrir's bloodline on a deeper level, and it began to unlock the true powers of its bloodline. It did not know if this was a result of the forest's unique quality or being the pack leader, but it knew that it had best utilize this chance to the best of its abilities. Comparatively, Lex was in too much of a rush to exit to consider any possible benefits he was receiving, let alone the fact that he was not really attracted by random benefits at the moment, either. As a result, he had not noticed at all that while he was in a position of leadership at Farrago, similar to how he led the inn, his leadership styles in both situations were extremely different. At the inn, he was more or less mellow, and took things slowly. He also could not use his workers the way he used the soldiers of that country. In comparison, in a single day he changed the destiny of the entire nation by being more strict with its policy and its people. Although it could not be claimed that Lex was cold-blooded and emotionless when designing the future policies for Farrago, he certainly did not shy away from putting them in harm's way to get the best results. He was completely oblivious to the drastic difference in result a simple mindset change had brought about. He could not be blamed for it though, as it was the hardest to pick out flaws in one's own behavior without it being pointed out. After all, everyone always assumed they were behaving the most logically, given their circumstances. After Lex concluded his final meeting and dismissed the final ministers, as he expected, he was teleported away. He did not know how the ministers of Farrago would behave after his disappearance, or how they would handle the selection of a new king without interfering with his established policies, but that was not his concern. The tower would take care of it. After being teleported out, a stream of information entered his brain. The first thing he learned was that the tower was called the Tower of Providence, and it had a very specific purpose. While entropy was the nature, or rather one aspect of the nature of the universe, it was not the nature of life. The tower worked against the forces of chaos to give the worthy a chance of survival. Although the effects of its efforts were extremely subtle on a universal scale, they were surely there, and guided the direction of the universe with a gentle hand. Such things were too far removed from Lex and were too abstract for him to comprehend or deal with. All he cared about was how to leave. But the tower was not done yet. More information entered his mind. Having completed the objective of the tower, Lex had now become an agent of Providence and had become connected to the tower. Their relationship had only just begun. Chapter 677 Lament. Lex suppressed a groan. He had lost count of how many universal entities he had established a relationship with. The Midnight End was obvious. Then there were a number of Dao lords and demi-Dao lords. Then there was the Hanali. One could not also forget the mysterious man who suddenly showed up inside his room one day. He should also not forget that he had an unknown enemy out there somewhere from whom he had stolen Fenrir. He had no idea what level that guy was at. There were also a number of systems he had been skirting around but avoiding getting too involved with, such as the Emporium and Reaving Dread mercenary group, the group through which the Inn hired extra guards for its events. As if all of that was not enough, now he had to deal with this Tower of Providence. Once he was done lamenting, he turned his attention back to the information he received. He had completed a task for the tower, so in exchange, the tower would reward him, and at the same time make him one of its agents. As an agent, a connection between him and the tower would be established, and he could apply to complete another task whenever he wanted. As a result, he would continue to be rewarded. Moreover, the rewards would not be random, but would be what he needed most at that time. If he chose to not take up any missions on his own, once every 100 years, the tower would randomly summon him to complete another task. Looking at it objectively, this wasn't such a bad thing. In fact, if other people encountered such a thing, they would consider it their lucky break, as they had encountered a fortuitous opportunity. Who would say no to being rewarded exactly what one needed most at the time? The thing was, Lex was really too busy to care about such things. Moreover, he had numerous ways to get great opportunities. Even if his quest rewards weren't counted, he could always just go fishing inside the well at the inn. As such, he really couldn't be bothered. It was like a multimillionaire who was forced to attend tedious meetings unrelated to his main business. Sure, he would be rewarded a few $100,000 now and again, but when compared to his main priorities, it really wasn't worth it. But, since it really wasn't in his control, he stopped brooding and turned his attention to his reward. Since it was apparently the thing he needed most at the moment, it would surely be great, right? Considering he was once again in the process of being teleported, and could not really move, he could not directly investigate the item that had landed in his hand. All he could do was check the information on it, which had also been sent to his mind. It was a golden-color translucent ball, which acted as a container for an extremely precious and rare item called Taros fertilizer. It had many uses, all of which had been listed systematically. The one that was most relevant to Lex, however, was that it drastically sped up the sprouting of a realm seed. Without it, the realm seed would take over 1,000,000 years to sprout, but with it only a few months would be needed. Lex froze. Well, technically he was already frozen in space, but now his mind also froze. The realm seed would take over 1,000,000 years to sprout normally? Why didn't he know this? Was this something the system would have taken care of, or was it something he would have had to figure out on his own? Logically, if one thought about it, it made sense. A normal realm was no small matter, and was different from the minor realms which were found everywhere. So for one to be created, it made sense that it would take a long time. But considering that the reward was from the system, he did not think too much about it. Now, it appeared as if things weren't so simple. Fortunately, he had run into the Tower of Providence, and received this reward. It really was the thing he needed most right now. He spent the remainder of his time considering if there were any other misconceptions he had about information given to him by the system. He had been misdirected so easily, despite the fact that he had his guard up. Once the teleportation finally ended, Lex found himself on the grassy plains through which he had been teleported away to begin with. He looked around to search for Fenrir, but did not find him. He was not too worried though, since according to the connection he had with Fenrir, the pup was fine. He would have to leave it behind, as he didn't have time to wait around for it, but as soon as it finished its task in the tower, Lex could directly summon it to himself. Next, he checked up on the system to ensure everything was fine, only to discover the abnormally powerful tribulation taking place. He was instantly reminded of the tribulation Ragnar underwent, and began adding additional protective formations around the tribulation room. This was insane. The power of these stronger tribulations was too much for him to bear at the moment with the facilities he had on hand. Maybe, in the future, he should set up a restriction on the level of guests allowed to attend the star rank upgrade ceremonies. Curious, he checked the identity of the person undergoing the tribulation, and discovered that it was the devil that Ragnar had challenged. His name was Warhile, and he seemed completely unbothered by the lightning that was ferociously striking his body. He was sitting casually with his legs folded, as if it was not something worth considering at all. A solemn look entered Lex's eyes. This devil was too powerful. Ragnar's performance was already impressive when he broke through, but this devil was even stronger. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 6, 78 out of time. Ragnar's tribulation, as Lex recalled, consisted of a single black lightning strike that destroyed almost every protection he set against it. Over 10 billion MP worth of protective formations had barely been enough to contain its awesome might, and in a sense, it had still failed. That was because the lightning strike had caused everyone to undergo a hallucination. While the hallucination itself was quite an experience, and provided many with a unique insight into facing tribulations, he did not want the incident to repeat. After all, many guests were either swimming, driving, fishing or doing other tasks, an interruption during which could cause serious harm. After all, there was even an area for guests to learn the Tao of the Sword from Kawain at the base of the Midnight Mountain. An unfortunately timed interruption could cause serious harm. As such, Lex had specially put formations that block spirit-based attacks around each abode. But what he could not do was afford to put 10 billion MP worth of formations around each abode, so what he did was simple. Since he had unlocked the feature of room creation when he was tasked to design the tribulation room, he tweaked each and every room he had. As soon as any room sensed a tribulation, they would automatically begin setting up protective formations around itself. Since this did not qualify as a service to the guest, since the room was protecting itself and not the guest, the price did not increase. As a result, Lex would be the one who had to pay. When he thought of the idea, Lex felt like a genius. Now though, he realized it was not so smart. This devil's tribulation, while similar to Ragnar's, was also different. There was black lightning, yes. But somehow, it did not seem as dangerous. Yet at the same time, instead of a single strike, there were multiple. He did not know if the overall difficulty was decreased, increased, or stayed the same. Yet he could tell, based on the massive bill he had accrued, that he definitely had been screwed over. Already 13 billion MP had been spent, and the tribulation was nowhere near over. But the higher expense did not reflect the true difficulty of the tribulation. This was because when Lex chose the formations himself, he would select formations which would support one another, thus allowing each one to absorb more damage. The formations chosen by the room itself were completely random. As long as their function was to protect the room, it would suffice. Shaking his head, Lex immediately took over and changed the formations. At the same time, his capitalistic gleam was revived. Mary, inform someone from the Jotun Empire. The devil that Ragnar challenged to a death match is about to be free. So long as he accepts, their match can be conducted. Unlike all the previous fights in the murder grounds, Lex wanted to stream this one so that he could earn some MP off of it. But the match would not be so quick. It would still take some time for the devil to overcome his tribulation, as best as he could tell. He checked up on the rest of the inn, and after ensuring everything was in order, decided to continue his journey. He had already noticed that Fenrir had not returned from the tower, but he was not concerned. Well, he was not too concerned. He was confident Fenrir would be able to overcome whatever trial it faced, and once it did and exited the tower, Lex would be able to use his connection to summon the pup to himself. Speaking of the tower, he had gotten a lead of what destiny rank meant. As usual, he could check the Emporium for it, but Lex did not bother with it for now. He'd get to it eventually. For now, his anxiety about running out of time was forcing him to rush to the Crystal Realm as quickly as possible. Taking out his ship, he once again continued on his journey, though this time he did not relax his vigilance at all. Days passed, and Alexander once again asked for his help as the situation on his planet was getting extremely difficult. Unfortunately for him, Lex could not yet spare any time. In fact, Lex no longer even took the time to enjoy the scenery as he traversed the land because he was too focused on getting to his destination. Once, he even had to resort to brute force and intimidation to avoid having his teleportation delayed. 2 weeks later, he finally reached the lands bordering the Crystal Nation. No race besides the Trollops were allowed to take control of the land near the Crystal Race, and even they were allowed to do so with very stringent requirements. They had to use their ability to terraform the land according to the aesthetics of the Crystal Race, which changed from time to time. Moreover, as strange as it felt, anyone wishing to enter the Crystal Nation had to go through an immigration process within the territory controlled by the Trollops. It was thus Lex found himself standing patiently in a long line of various races, many he had never even heard of, both humanoid as well as quadrupeds. He stood at the base of a hill, and the line extended well over the peak of it and beyond to the other side, so he had no idea how long it would take. But for once, he had no choice but to be patient. No one dared be presumptuous bordering the territory of the Crystal Race. Fortunately, after asking around, Lex discovered that there was no need for a passport or anything along those lines. If there was, he didn't know what he would do. As for what the immigration process actually entailed, no one knew exactly. They would be made to walk through a number of formations, the purpose of which was unknown. If, for any reason, one of the formations detected that there was something wrong with you, you would be marked. Once marked, the security team, which consisted of a race known as Earth Golems, would escort you to a room where the Trollop in charge of the territory would interview you. At no point in the entire process would anyone be harmed, at least according to the established precedent, though whether you would be allowed to enter or not was up to fate. No one knew exactly what would prevent one from being cleared for entry, which is why everyone was always tense. Since they would be spending the next few hours together, Lex got comfortable and befriended the reptilian creatures next to him. As for what race they were, they themselves did not seem to know. Or at least, since they knew who they were, they did not feel like knowing what others called them mattered. Apparently, they had been specifically selected to inhabit some territory within the Crystal Nation. But despite their invitation, their destination remained a mystery to them. Who invited them or why were all questions that they did not consider asking. After all, most of the lesser races in this entire realm practically worshipped the Crystal Race. Upon getting a chance to live in their empire, none would bother asking arbitrary questions. Despite their lack of, due to their limited intelligence, there was not a lot Lex could learn from them, so instead he began practicing his Innkeeper charm to keep the conversation going. The truth was, he needed to distract himself as best as he could during this long wait, because his increasing anxiety had suddenly vanished. But the disappearance was not a good thing. From the sensation his instincts were giving him, it felt as if he had already run out of time for something. Far away from the Crystal Race, on the borders of the Hum Nation, an army larger than ever appeared as if overnight. The land was blanketed in darkness as if the night sky was reflected on the ground, but the truth was nowhere near as beautiful or poetic. The black, poisonous slime covered the millions of craven that were crossing had covered the ground evenly, not allowing a single speck of earth to remain untainted. The army broke through the border, and invaded the nation with an unyielding ferocity, the likes of which even the craven themselves had never shown. Moreover, it was not just the humans that were being targeted. Every nation other than the Crystal One was suddenly being invaded, all at once. The feeble defense of the walls and formations crumbled under the tide of immortal craven, and soon after, so too did the towns and cities begin to fall. The unprecedented attack on all fronts began without any warning, and continued to crash forth as if it had no intention of stopping. It seemed the craven were determined to end this war, once and for all. Chapter 6, 79 Answers. An unstoppable tide was sweeping across the Crystal Realm, targeting those lands owned by the nations as well as those farther, disconnected lands held by mere nobles or less powerful races. There was no forewarning for this attack, nor had there been such a massive invading force of craven ever before. The number of immortals deployed was far beyond a number that any one nation could employ. Perhaps if multiple nations worked together, they could muster up the number of immortals required to fight off the force invading a single one of them. Yet, as things stood, there seemed to be little to no recourse. The only remaining advantage they had was that the crystal realm was so ridiculously vast, it would take even immortals a lot of time to traverse if they were not taking teleportation formations. Moreover, since the force was invading, they had to ensure they thoroughly swept each and every spot, so not only did they move slowly, they could not utilize teleportation formations. A state of emergency was declared in every single nation, and mass evacuations were underway. Martial law, Code Black, and various other such names were thrown around in almost every conversation, and the countries decided how much of their territory to give up while they prepared their own defenses. Despite their clear disadvantage, it was not as if there was nothing they could do to retaliate. The Sol and Frio birds depended on the massive populations, just as much as the people living there required those birds. This was a secret well kept, but was now put to use in every battlefront. Although enemies of this level would not do any harm to the Craven, yet, the birds pulled out of the territories being invaded, plunging the land into darkness. Such was the case with all the territories controlled by the Craven. Yet despite being inundated by endless monsters spawned from the darkness, they always seemed to have enough forces to spare for attacks. For now, the trend seemed to be set. The Craven were advancing forward, and none of those being invaded seemed capable enough to stop them. The process had just begun, so there was no indication yet of how the nations would retaliate once they got a hold of the situation, but many were already praying that the crystal race would get involved. Well, at least the citizens were praying for such. Meanwhile, at the border for the crystal nation, Lex continued to wait in line. In stark contrast to much of the realm, he enjoyed the peaceful environment and continued to wait in line. In fact, he bought some of the local fruits from a peddler who continued to walk beside the line, hoping to attract the attention of those waiting. It was quite a pleasant experience. Several hours later, when Lex was nearing his turn to proceed through the investigative formations, a worried Mary contacted him. "Lex, there's a situation I think you need to be updated on," she said, hesitant yet concerned. "We have some new pro bono guests, which is quite normal. But the issue is the information they revealed. When they arrived, they were in quite a wounded state. Such situations are quite normal among pro bono guests, so they were brought to the recovery pods. It's when they woke and began conversing amongst themselves that I noticed something unusual. They seemed to be mentioning a massive army of Craven. They were overwhelmed and their city immediately fell under their siege." "As unfortunate a thing as it is," Lex replied, "such things happen quite regularly here. The war with the Craven hasn't stopped in hundreds of years. If that were all, it would not be worth notifying you. I thought the behavior of the survivors was unusual, and so sent Velma to investigate and interview them. As it turns out, the county they were in was 4 counties away from the battlefront. The Craven should not have been able to just appear there overnight. Most importantly, while the survivors themselves were too weak to be sure, they claimed that the number of immortals was way too high. Their city wasn't able to put up a defense at all." Lex frowned. He did not have enough information about the situation to judge it accurately. "Keep an eye on guests from the Crystal Realm. See if you can learn any more information about the situation." "What race are the guests from?" "The guests are sentinels. They don't feel too comfortable at the inn, considering the number of humans and humanoid beings, but they are too afraid to return home. I recall we made a spot at the inn for all the spirits and encouraged them to go there. Recommend that area to the sentinel race, they might be more comfortable there. In the meantime, keep investigating. If you learn anything relevant, don't hesitate to contact me." For a moment, Lex wondered if the anxiety he had been feeling had anything to do with the aforementioned Craven invasion, but concluded that he did not have information. Although the timing seemed to match, there was no saying for certain if the matters were related. After all, Lex's instincts would only come into play if he would be the one affected. How could he possibly be influenced by an invasion far off? He turned his attention back to the line, as soon it would be his turn. Feeling as if he was walking through security at an airport, Lex eventually walked over the illuminated path through a number of formations. As he passed, he could feel himself being probed by various senses, though he was not sure exactly what the formations were looking for. There seemed to be no problem, though, and at the end Lex was led to a private room by a massive earth golem. Inside the room, surprisingly, sat a human in a security guard uniform, studying a document. Without looking up, the man asked, "Name and purpose of visit?" "My name is Lex," he said, feeling a mix of amusement and disbelief. "My purpose here is to visit an elder of the crystal race. He invited me to meet him upon completion of a task he gave. Do you have anything that can corroborate your claim of an invitation? Or do you know the name and address of the elder you are referring to? We can ascertain the veracity of your claims ourselves as well." "I have this," said Lex, as he handed over the letter given to him by the crystal race elder so long ago. It was sealed, and Lex had not tried to open it, yet he had read the name and address on the letter. It bore the elder's name alongside some numbers the purpose of which Lex could not yet identify, as well as the name of the place the elder asked Lex to meet him, Valesco. The guard read the elder's name, which was Ezio, and showed no reaction, but when he read the name Valesco he was startled and sat up straight. He gave Lex a bewildered look, before turning his attention back to the letter. Despite his station, he did not dare open it himself. "Please wait here a moment," the guard said, and scurried out the door, letter still in hand. Lex expected somewhat of a reaction, since he had learned that Valesco was a prison. Yet this was too much, right? A short while later, a small cat made of tree roots walked in, followed closely by the guard, and jumped up onto the table. This was the smallest trilop Lex had ever seen, but the aura he radiated was one of the strongest. It reminded him of Auntie Gina, one of the first trilops he had ever met. To date, Lex felt like she was the strongest trilop he had ever encountered. This tiny cat was a close second. "Dear guest, do not be alarmed. Your admission into the Crystal Nation is all but assured. We just need to ask a few mandatory questions for our own record-keeping purposes. Can you share with me when you received this invitation?" "I can't remember exactly how long it's been, but it's already been many months," Lex said. To be honest, since he left Earth, he had stopped paying attention to the calendar. He didn't even know what month it was. Maybe he should create his own calendar once he has his own realm, so that he can keep better track of time. "Can you share the location you were at when you received the invitation?" "Inside a minor realm." "Were there any significant events that took place during your visit to that particular minor realm?" "A couple, I suppose. For one, we discovered a sleeping chamber of the crystal race. I don't know what happened to it, but we reported it to our seniors at the time. The second was a run-in with a craven. To this day, no one knows why a single craven was able to infiltrate that realm, and why it did so alone." The more answers Lex gave, the more grave the cat looked, until Lex eventually realized something was wrong. Chapter 680 Lord Belmont. Since the immigration process seemed to be quite thorough, it made sense that Lex would be questioned in detail about his purpose. Considering that he learned that the invitation he had was from a supposed prison, he had already prepared himself to face some difficulty. But the issue was, Lex wasn't really facing any problems at all. In fact, even during the questioning process everyone was quite civil. The problem was, the more questions that Lex answered, the more his questioners looked grave. It was as if their roles were reversed and Lex was grilling them instead of the other way around. Is everything all right?" Lex asked, when he realized there was a pause in the questions, as the trilop seemed to be digesting his answer. "Yes. You have been cleared for entry, but there are some follow-up procedures you have to take part in. Come with me." The cat jumped off the table and led Lex out of the room and away from the immigration area. Once outside the building, the cat seemed to grow with each step as more roots emerged from the ground and joined with its body, until eventually the cat's body became as large as a horse. "Climb abroad, it'll be quicker that way," said the trilop, with no regard for the dignity of an immortal. Lex felt slightly awkward, but lacking any real reverence towards immortals, he did not hesitate and soon found himself nestled atop the wooden cat. "Hang on tight," it said, before it suddenly leaped forward, nearly jerking Lex off its back. Fortunately, Lex had quick reflexes and tightened his grip on the cat's body with his legs. A part of him wanted to ask the cat if it could use the roots that made its body to form stirrups or a seatbelt, but then thought better of it. "I am taking you to one of the gates to the Crystal Nation," the Trollope told him. "From there, you will be escorted to Valesco. I will share some of the crystal race customs with you, so you do not remain ignorant of what is happening around you. First of all, and most importantly, inside the Crystal Nation, you will have the status of a guest. That will afford you some perks, but it will also restrict you. For example, you will not be judged for any crimes you've committed outside the Crystal Nation, so long as it wasn't against a member of the Crystal race. However, your rights within the nation are severely restricted. Without a member of the Crystal race sponsoring you, you cannot get a job, own or rent property, attend a school, enter museums, enter certain areas in their cities, hunt, or approach private property. Those are just some of the restrictions on you. But you do not have to worry about that, as you have a sponsor, which will be Ezio. Another thing, if you accidentally commit a crime while following the orders of your sponsor, you will not be held liable. Instead, it is the sponsor who will have to answer for your actions. Thirdly, if a priest or pastor of any of the temples requests your presence, you do not have the right to reject. I highly recommend you stay as far away from them as possible, as attracting their attention will not usually end well for you. Fourthly, if a member of the Crystal race takes interest in you, in any capacity, you have the right to refuse, or strike up a bargain. Fifthly, and most importantly in your case, if you become a witness in an ongoing legal dispute among members of the Crystal race, you will be forced to remain as long as the dispute trial goes on. In this, you will have no say. Why is the last one most important for me? Lex asked gravely, a guess forming in his mind. It couldn't be, right? The cat turned its head to look at Lex, hesitation in its eyes. It seemed to be debating something in its mind, but eventually decided not to answer. You'll know soon enough. Faster than Lex anticipated, they arrived at the border to the Crystal Nation, which had literal walls extending both ways, with a magnificent 100 feet, 30 meters, gate in the middle. Though the walls were only slightly shorter than the gate itself, something told Lex that flying above them would prove easier said than done. A number of guards stood at the gate, wearing armor and holding up long spears. Though it was hard to tell, since every inch of their body was covered by the armor, not even revealing their eyes, Lex believed these guards were of the Crystal race. From what he recalled, the Crystal race was a very conservative race who did not like showing their crystal to anyone. If they revealed their crystal to you, it was a sign of great trust and intimacy. Usually. There were, of course, many members of their race who lived quite liberally and showed off their crystals bare in the wind, like precious stones. The guards, who stood there like statues as a number of various races passed them by, seemed to gain a semblance of life as they noticed the Trollope appearing, an unknown human astride it. "Ahoy Sylvia," said one of the guards, clearly familiar with the Trollope. "How fares thy against the horde of migrants? 'Tis the season of new blood, and so new blood comes roaring through to the kingdom of crystal." "You're not a poet, Fran." "Don't try to be eloquent," the cat replied, the dismissal ready on her lips. It seemed like the two were old friends. The other guard only chuckled, but the exchange ended there, and the cat swiftly skipped the queue and took Lex through the gates. His senses tingled as he passed through, a consequence of his affinity for space he guessed. The world beyond the gate seemed entirely different. This is what his guests probably experienced, Lex thought as the pure and somehow cleaner spiritual energy swirled around him, washing away the pollution that was